The rope creaked in the bitter wind, swaying against the sky heavy with snow clouds. Jackson Blackwood stood motionless on the wooden platform, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared into the frigid Montana air. The hemp noose hung loose around his neck, rough fibers scratching against his skin with each gust of wind. Below him, the citizens of redemption gathered in the town square, collars pulled high against the cold faces grim beneath the brims of hats and bonnets. No cheers, no jeers, just the solemn quiet of justice being served in a land where survival itself was hard won. Sheriff Thomas Holt adjusted his gloves, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he gripped the lever that would drop the trapdoor beneath Jackson's feet. The local newspaper editor scribbled notes with a pencil gone dull, documenting another frontier hanging for the weekly edition. "Jackson Blackwood," the sheriff announced, voice carrying across the square. "You have been found guilty of theft from the town stores and resisting lawful arrest. The penalty, as prescribed by territorial law, is death by hanging. Have you any final words?" Jackson's eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Somewhere up there in a cave warmed by a small fire, his boys waited. Matthew and Daniel, 8 and 6, waiting for a father who wouldn't return. "I've nothing to say," Jackson replied, his voice hoarse but steady. "Let's be done with it." Sheriff Holt nodded, his hand tightening on the lever. The crowd leaned forward, that instinctive human reaction to witness the moment life leaves a body. "Stop!" The voice cut through the silence like an axe splitting wood. Heads turned, the crowd parting, as a woman pushed her way through, her cloak dark against the snow-covered ground. Eleanor Hayes moved with determination despite her heavily pregnant state, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other clutching a folded document. Her face, framed by auburn hair escaping from her bonnet, showed neither fear nor uncertainty, only fierce resolve. "You cannot hang this man," she declared, reaching the front of the crowd, her breath ragged from exertion. Sheriff Holt's hand remained on the lever, but his brow furrowed. "Ma'am, this is a lawful execution. Please step back." Eleanor straightened, wincing slightly as she did. "I invoke the Frontier Labor Act of 1871. She held up the document. "This man can serve his sentence through indentured labor rather than hanging." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jackson's gaze finally broke from the mountains, his eyes finding Eleanor's with confusion and the first flicker of hope. "That law is for debtors, not thieves," Sheriff Holt replied, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Section 4, paragraph 3 extends the provision to nonviolent criminals during times of territorial need." Eleanor's voice didn't waver. "I have a homestead 7 miles out. My husband died 3 months ago. I'm due any day now, with no one to help birth this child or maintain the property." She stepped forward, extending the document. "I have the magistrate's seal from Pine Creek. This is legal and binding." The sheriff reluctantly descended from the platform, taking the document with a skeptical frown. He read slowly, lips moving slightly, before looking up with evident displeasure. "It appears to be in order," he admitted grudgingly. "Then remove the noose from his neck," Eleanor demanded. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jackson was unbound, the noose removed. When his boots hit the packed earth of the town square, his legs nearly buckled beneath him. Eleanor approached him, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "If you run, they'll hunt you down and hang you anyway. Your only chance is to come with me." Jackson studied her face, searching for deceit or hidden motive. Finding none, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Mrs. Hayes," Sheriff Holt said, handing back the document, "he's your responsibility now. If he causes any trouble, it'll be on your head." Eleanor took the paper, tucking it inside her cloak. "I understand." As they walked away from the gallows, the crowd parted silently. Jackson felt their stares like physical weight upon his back. He'd been prepared to dig. Now he found himself following a pregnant stranger toward an uncertain future. Neither spoke until they reached a small wagon at the edge of town. Eleanor climbed awkwardly onto the bench, gathering the reins of a tired-looking bay mare. "Get in," she said, not looking at him. Jackson hesitated only briefly before climbing up beside her. The wagon lurched forward, leaving redemption behind. 1 week earlier, Jackson had stood at the edge of the forest, watching his breath form crystals in the frigid air. The mountains loomed around him, their familiar slopes offering no comfort this time. He'd spent 3 years building a life here after Sarah died, trapping, hunting, teaching his boys how to survive in this unforgiving place. But the winter had come early and stayed late. Game had grown scarce, then vanished altogether. Their stores of dried meat and preserved berries had dwindled to nothing. 3 days had passed since any of them had eaten more than a handful of pine nuts and melted snow. Inside their small cabin, Matthew and Daniel slept, their faces thin and pale. Jackson had watched them through the night, listened to their breathing grow shallow, felt their foreheads for fever. By morning, he knew he had no choice. "Boys," he said, kneeling beside their shared bed, "we need to move." Matthew, already like his father, in too many ways understood immediately. At 8, he'd seen enough hardship to recognize the gravity in his father's tone. "The cave," Jackson nodded. "Pack only what you need. We leave within the hour." The cave lay 3 miles up the mountain, a place they'd used for storage and emergency shelter. It wasn't much, a narrow opening that widened into a space barely large enough for 3 people, but it had a natural chimney that would allow a small fire without suffocation. "Are we in trouble, Pa?" Daniel asked, his small voice tight with fear. Jackson pulled his younger son close, feeling the boy's ribs through his worn shirt. "No, son, we're just being smart. The hunting might be better higher up." It was a lie, and Matthew's eyes told Jackson he knew it. But Daniel nodded, the simple faith of a 6-year-old who still believed his father could fix anything. By midday, Jackson had settled the boys in the cave with their few remaining supplies: a small sack of pine nuts, 2 strips of jerky he'd been saving, and clear instructions. "Matthew, you're in charge until I return. Keep the fire small. Don't leave the cave." "Where are you going?" Matthew asked, his young face already bearing the weight of responsibility too heavy for his years. Jackson checked his knife. The rifle had been traded months ago for flour and salt. "Down to the town. I'll bring back food." "The town doesn't like us," Matthew said quietly, remembering their last attempt to trade there. "They don't have to like us," Jackson replied, ruffling his son's hair. "I'll be back before the moon is full. 2 days at most. You know what to do if I'm not back by then." Matthew nodded solemnly. "Head east to the Wilson homestead." "That's right. Old Mrs. Wilson has a soft spot for children, even mountain children." Jackson embraced both boys, holding them longer than usual, memorizing the feel of them in his arms. "I'll be back before you know it." He felt Matthew's eyes on his back as he left the cave, the boy's unspoken understanding hanging in the air between them. At 8 years old, Matthew already knew the world could take without warning, without mercy. He'd learned that lesson when his mother died, bringing Daniel into the world. As Jackson made his way down the mountain, each step taking him further from his sons, memories of Sarah swept over him like the bitter wind. Her laugh, her hands always busy with some task, her fierce love for Matthew and the child they had been expecting. He'd been a different man. Then Dr. Nathan Blackwood recently returned from the war, building a practice in a small Illinois town. The war had changed him, as it had changed everyone who'd lived through it. He'd seen too much death, sewn up, too many bodies torn apart by cannon and bullet. But he'd believed in healing and starting fresh. Sarah had been his anchor, his reason to believe in tomorrow. Then came that night, the night that had sent him fleeing west with a new name and a newborn son. The night Maxwell Reynolds' son had broken into their home, desperate for morphine to feed an addiction born on battlefield hospitals. The struggle, the knife, the terrible realization as the young man's life bled out on their kitchen floor. Reynolds had been a judge, a powerful man with a grief that curdled to vengeance. The charges had been clear murder. No consideration for self-defense, for protecting a pregnant wife. Jackson had taken Daniel, barely a day old, collected Matthew from a neighbor, and disappeared into the night. 3 years of running, of surviving, of building something resembling a life in these mountains. 3 years of looking over his shoulder, of teaching his boys to be wary of strangers. 3 years that had led him to this desperate journey down the mountain, toward a town that viewed mountain folk with suspicion at best. Jackson reached redemption as dusk settled over the valley. The town was small: a church, a saloon, a general store, and a scattering of homes. Lanterns were being lit, casting yellow rectangles onto the snow-covered main street. He kept to the shadows, watching, waiting. The storeroom behind Jameson's general store wasn't difficult to find, nor was it particularly well secured, a simple padlock that yielded to his knife with minimal effort. Inside, shelves lined with goods made his mouth water: sacks of flour and beans, jars of preserved fruit, slabs of salt pork. Jackson took only what they needed to survive: a small sack of flour, some beans, a jar of molasses, dried apples. He wrapped them in his coat, securing the bundle with a length of rope. It would be enough to keep the boys alive until spring brought fresh game. He was nearly clear of town when a voice called out behind him. "You there, stop!" Jackson ran. Through the darkness, boots slipping on ice-slicked streets, bundle clutched to his chest. Behind him, shouts grew louder. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood somewhere to his right. He might have made it if not for the patch of black ice near the livery. His feet went out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground, the precious bundle skidding away across the frozen earth. Before he could regain his feet, rough hands grabbed him, forcing him down into the snow. "Got him, Sheriff!" a voice called triumphantly. "Caught himself, a mountain thief!" Jackson stopped struggling, knowing it was futile. Above him, faces appeared in the lantern light, the sheriff, the store owner, several townsfolk drawn by the commotion. "Well, well," Sheriff Holt said, peering down at him. "What have we here? A thief in the night." "My children are starving," Jackson said, the words torn from him by desperation. "I took only what we needed to survive." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Should have thought of that before setting up in those mountains, away from decent folk." The law's the law. As they dragged him toward the jailhouse, Jackson's thoughts weren't on his own fate, but on Matthew and Daniel, waiting in that cave, watching the days pass, waiting for a father who wouldn't return. Eleanor Hayes winced as the wagon hit another rut in the frozen road. Beside her, Jackson Blackwood sat silent, his face a mask of stoic endurance. They'd left Redemption 3 hours ago, and he'd spoken barely a dozen words since. "We'll reach my place before nightfall," she said, breaking the silence. "It's not much, but it's solid. My husband built it well." Jackson glanced at her, then back at the road. "Why did you do it?" Eleanor kept her eyes forward, adjusting her grip on the reins. "I told you, I need help. You need to not hang." She paused. Seemed like a fair arrangement. "There are other men in town, men without theft charges, men who know farming. And not one of them would come out to a widow's place 7 miles from town with a baby due and winter not yet broken." She gave him a sidelong glance. "Besides, I've heard about you, the mountain man with 2 children. A man like that knows how to survive." Jackson stiffened. "What else have you heard? That your wife died, that you keep to yourself, that before you came to these parts, you were someone else entirely." Eleanor guided the horse around a fallen branch. "But then most people who come west are running from something." The tension in Jackson's shoulders didn't ease. "My sons are up in the mountains, in a cave near Pine Ridge. They have little food left." Eleanor nodded as if she had expected this. "We'll get them. Not today, I'm too tired, and this little one is making herself known." She rubbed her belly. "But tomorrow, if the weather holds. I can go tonight. Bring them back by morning. And leave me alone 9 months pregnant after I just saved you from the gallows." Eleanor shook her head. "I may be desperate, Mr. Blackwood, but I'm not a fool. You'll stay tonight, help me with the evening chores, and we'll fetch your boys tomorrow." Jackson fell silent again, his jaw working with unspoken argument. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "One night," he agreed, "then I bring my boys down." As the wagon crested a small rise, Eleanor's homestead came into view. A cabin built of sturdy logs, a barn to one side, a chicken coop, and a small fenced area that might have been a garden in warmer months. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was there. Jackson tensed hand, going instinctively to his side where a weapon would have been. "It's all right," Eleanor said, noting his reaction. "That'll be Ezekiel Reed, the preacher from town. He checks on me when he can." Indeed, as they pulled up to the cabin, the door opened to reveal a tall, lean man in a black coat, his beard streaked with gray, a Bible clutched in one hand. "Mrs. Hayes," he called, stepping out onto the porch. "I was growing concerned." He stopped abruptly when he saw Jackson. "I see you went through with it." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon with difficulty, accepting the preacher's helping hand. "As we discussed, yes." Reed's eyes never left Jackson's face. There was something in that gaze beyond the wariness one might expect, a flash of recognition quickly masked. "Mr. Blackwood," Reed said carefully, "I trust you understand the opportunity you've been given today." Jackson stepped down from the wagon, his movements deliberate. "I do." "Good." Reed turned back to Eleanor. "I've stoked the fire and put on a pot of stew. Not much, I'm afraid, some root vegetables and a bit of salt pork." "That's more than enough, Ezekiel. Thank you." Eleanor moved toward the cabin, one hand supporting her lower back. Mr. Blackwood will help me with the rest of the evening chores. Reed hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave. I could stay the night, sleep in the barn. There's no need, Eleanor replied firmly. Mr. Blackwood knows what's at stake if he were to disappoint me. The preacher looked between them, then nodded slowly. Very well. I'll return in a few days to check on you. As Reed mounted his horse and rode away, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the man had recognized him. Truly recognized him beyond the mountain man reputation he'd acquired in these parts. Inside the cabin was simple but well made. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cooking pot hanging over flames that cast dancing shadows across the plank floor. A table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, a curtained-off area that presumably held a bed. Everything neat, orderly, but with signs of abandonment, a layer of dust on shelves, cobwebs in corners. Sit, Eleanor said, gesturing to the table. You look half-starved. Jackson remained standing. I need to tend to your horse first. Eleanor studied him for a moment and then nodded. Barn's fully stocked. Hay in the loft, grain in the bin by the door. Water pumps on the south side might need priming if it's frozen. When Jackson returned half an hour later, the stew was bubbling, filling the cabin with a savory aroma that made his stomach clench painfully. He'd cared for the horse, checked the chicken coop, and brought in more firewood. Basic chores that felt strange after 3 years of mountain living. Eleanor sat in the rocking chair, one hand absently stroking her belly. She'd removed her cloak and bonnet, revealing a simple blue dress stretched tight over her pregnant form. Her auburn hair was pinned in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame a face that looked exhausted beyond its years. You have questions, she said as he closed the door behind him. As do I, but first we eat. The stew was simple: turnips, carrots, potatoes, and small pieces of salt pork, but to Jackson it was a feast. He ate slowly, forcing himself not to bolt the food despite his hunger. Your boys, Eleanor said, after they'd eaten in silence for several minutes. How old are they? Matthew is 8, Daniel is 6. And their mother? Jackson's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. She died when Daniel was born. Eleanor nodded her hand, moving to her belly again. I'm sorry. They finished the meal in silence. Afterward, Jackson insisted on washing the dishes while Eleanor rested by the fire. There's a pallet in the storage room, she said, nodding toward a door off the main room. Blankets in the chest. It's not much, but it's warmer than a jail cell. Or a noose, Jackson added quietly. Eleanor's lips curved in a small, tired smile. Indeed. Later, as Jackson lay on the pallet in the small storeroom, listening to the wind howl outside, his thoughts turned to his sons. Were they warm enough? Had they rationed the food as he'd instructed? Was Matthew keeping the fire small as he'd been taught? He considered slipping away in the night, taking the horse riding up to the cave, bringing the boys back here before dawn. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the debt he now owed this woman. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she was right. She needed help, and soon. Sleep came eventually, troubled by dreams of rope and gallows, of small bodies, cold and still, in a mountain cave of Sarah's face as she slipped away, of blood pooling on a kitchen floor in Illinois. Eleanor sat alone at the table long after Jackson had retired to the storeroom. Her back ached and the baby kicked restlessly beneath her ribs. She reached for the small box she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the hearth. Inside lay a collection of letters carefully preserved. She withdrew one, unfolding the paper with practiced care, though she knew the words by heart. My dearest Eleanor, the hospital is overrun again. So many boys so young with wounds that defy description. I thank God daily for your steady hands beside mine as we work. Today I assisted Dr. Blackwood with a particularly difficult case, a young soldier with a chest wound that would have been fatal in less capable hands. Dr. Blackwood is a marvel to watch. While other surgeons rush through procedures concerned only with quantity, he takes care with each patient, sees them as men, rather than merely bodies to be mended. I believe I am learning more from him than from all my medical texts combined. When this war finally ends, I hope to emulate his approach in civilian practice, to remember that healing requires not just skill, but humanity. Eleanor carefully refolded the letter, one of many James had written during their time serving in a field hospital during the war. James Hayes had been a medical assistant, eager to learn, passionate about healing. Eleanor had been a nurse, one of many women who left home to tend the wounded and dying. And Nathan Blackwood, now calling himself Jackson, had been one of the most skilled surgeons in the Union Army. She had recognized him immediately when they brought him to the gallows, though years of hardship had carved new lines in his face, turned his hair gray at the temples. She hadn't planned to invoke the labor law. It had been Ezekiel Reed's suggestion when she'd confided her recognition to him days earlier. A doctor, he had mused, even one in hiding would be a godsend in these parts. Eleanor returned the letter to its box, wincing as a contraction tightened across her belly. Not labor yet, just practice, as her mother would have called it. Still, she knew the time was drawing near. She placed a hand over the spot where her child kicked. "Your father would have liked him," she whispered. "A good man in terrible circumstances." Eleanor hadn't told Jackson she knew who he truly was. Not yet. There would be time for that after his sons were safe, after the baby came, after trust had been established. For now, it was enough that he was here, that he would help her through what was to come. She made her way to bed, moving carefully in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, at least neither of them was alone. Dawn broke cold in clear sunlight glinting off the snow-covered landscape. Jackson rose early, rekindled the fire, and set water to boil before venturing outside to tend the animals. The routine felt strange domestic chores he hadn't performed since Illinois. Feeding chickens, carrying water, splitting wood for the day's fires. His body remembered the rhythms, though falling into patterns established long before his flight to the mountains. He was returning with an armload of split logs when he saw Eleanor on the porch wrapped in a heavy shawl watching him. "You're efficient," she observed. James took twice as long with the morning chores. Jackson stacked the wood neatly by the door. "Your husband wasn't used to hard work." A smile crossed Eleanor's face. James was many things, but physically robust wasn't among them. He had other strengths. She gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside. We should eat before we head up the mountain." Over a breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with molasses, they discussed the journey to retrieve his sons. "The cave is about 4 hours from here on horseback," Jackson explained. "Longer if the snow's deep." Eleanor nodded. "We'll take the wagon as far as we can, then I'll wait while you go the rest of the way on foot." "You shouldn't come at all," Jackson argued. "In your condition." "In my condition, I'm not letting you ride off alone with my only horse." Eleanor's tone brooked no argument. "Besides, your boys might be frightened coming down to a strange place. Having a woman present might ease their minds." Jackson wanted to protest further, but recognized the practicality of her reasoning. More importantly, he recognized the determination in her eyes. This was a woman accustomed to having her way. They set out mid-morning, the wagon loaded with blankets, food, and extra clothing for the boys. The weather held the sun, providing weak warmth as they followed a narrow trail into the foothills. "How did you end up in these parts?" Jackson asked as Eleanor guided the horse around a fallen tree. "James wanted to practice medicine where it was needed most," she replied, eyes on the trail. "The war showed us both how much suffering exists in the world and how little help reaches remote places." Jackson glanced at her sharply. "Your husband was a doctor, an assistant surgeon during the war. He was studying to complete his medical training." A shadow crossed her face. The consumption took him before he could finish. They continued in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the steady breath of the horse. "And you," Eleanor finally asked, "what brought a man with 2 small boys to these mountains?" Jackson's face closed off. "Fresh start. Needed space to raise my sons away from complications." Eleanor didn't press, but her expression suggested she understood more than he was saying. By early afternoon, they reached a point where the trail narrowed too much for the wagon. Jackson helped Eleanor down, settling her on a fallen log with blankets and the remains of their midday meal. "I'll go the rest of the way on foot," he said, checking the knife at his belt, the only weapon he had. "Stay here. If I'm not back by sunset." "You will be," Eleanor interrupted, "with 2 hungry boys in tow. Now go." Jackson hesitated, studying her face. "Why are you really doing this, Mrs. Hayes, the truth?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Because I know what it's like to be alone in a hard land. Because your boys deserve more than dying in a cave while their father swings from a rope." She paused. "And because James would have done the same." Something passed between them in that moment, not quite trust, but understanding. Jackson nodded once, then turned toward the steeper path that would lead to the cave. The climb was arduous, the snow deeper than he'd anticipated. By the time he spotted the cave entrance, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. Anxiety quickened his steps. Had the boys maintained the fire? Had they rationed the food as instructed? Matthew, he called, approaching the narrow opening. Daniel. Silence greeted him. Heart-pounding, Jackson ducked into the cave, eyes adjusting to the dim light. The small fire pit held only cold ashes. The boy's few belongings remained, but there was no sign of his sons. Matthew, Daniel. His voice echoed back, hollow with fear. Then he heard a small sound from deeper in the cave, from a crevice he'd shown Matthew in case of danger. Puh, the voice was small, uncertain. Jackson moved toward the sound, dropping to his knees. Matthew, it's me, son. It's safe to come out. A moment later, Matthew emerged from the crevice, his young face gaunt, but determined. Behind him, Daniel appeared, eyes wide with disbelief and joy. Pa! Daniel launched himself forward, colliding with Jackson's chest in a desperate embrace. You came back! Jackson gathered both boys to him, feeling their small bodies trembling against his. Of course I came back. I promised, didn't I? Matthew pulled back slightly, his eyes searching his father's wicked one. You were gone so long. We thought... I know. Jackson smoothed his son's tangled hair. I'm sorry, there were complications. But I'm here now and I've found us a place to stay. Not in town, Matthew asked warily. No, not in town. A homestead a few hours from here. A lady named Mrs. Hayes needs help with her farm. We'll have food shelter. Daniel, still clutching his father's coat, looked up with hopeful eyes. Is she nice? Jackson thought of Eleanor waiting below, heavy with child, offering sanctuary to a man she barely knew, and his half-wild children. Yes, he said softly. I believe she is. They gathered the boys' few possessions quickly. Jackson was alarmed at how light Daniel felt when he lifted him, how much weight both boys had lost in the days he'd been gone. The jerky and pine nuts were gone. They'd been surviving on melted snow and hope. The descent was slower, with Daniel riding on Jackson's back and Matthew following carefully behind. By the time they reached the spot where Eleanor waited, the sun was low on the horizon. She stood as they approached, one hand supporting her back, the other shading her eyes against the setting sun. Jackson felt Matthew tense beside him, the boy's ingrained wariness of strangers asserting itself. Mrs. Hayes, Jackson called, these are my sons, Matthew and Daniel. Eleanor's face softened as she took in the two thin boys. Hello, Matthew. Hey, hello, Daniel. I'm very glad to meet you both. Daniel, always the more trusting, gave a shy wave. Matthew merely nodded, pressing closer to his father's side. I've kept some stew warm, Eleanor said, gesturing to a small pot near the remains of a fire. You must be hungry. At the mention of food, both boys' reserve melted somewhat. They ate quickly, though Jackson noticed Matthew taking small portions, saving more for his younger brother, a habit born of months of scarcity. You can have more, Eleanor told him gently. There's plenty. Matthew glanced at his father, who nodded encouragement. Only then did the boy take a second helping. The journey back to the homestead was slow, with Daniel falling asleep in the wagon and Matthew fighting to keep his eyes open. By the time they arrived, stars had appeared in the clear night sky, and a bitter wind had picked up from the north. Storm coming, Eleanor observed as Jackson carried Daniel inside. We got back just in time. The cabin seemed smaller with 4 people inside, but infinitely warmer than the cave had been. Eleanor quickly arranged bedding for the boys near the fireplace, adding extra blankets against the coming cold. They can have the storeroom tomorrow, she said quietly as Jackson tucked them in. Once we've cleaned it properly. For tonight, the fire will keep them warm. Jackson watched his sons settle into sleep, their faces relaxed for the first time in months. When he looked up, he found Eleanor observing him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. Thank you, he said simply. She nodded, then winced, one hand going to her belly. Are you all right? Jackson moved toward her, concern evident in his face. Just tired, she replied, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the back of a chair. It's been a long day. Jackson wasn't convinced. How close are you to your time? Close enough, Eleanor admitted. But first, babies often come late, or so my mother always said. Before Jackson could respond, a gust of wind rattled the windows and snow began to fall, in earnest, driven sideways by the gathering storm. We should secure everything for the night, he said, moving toward the door. I'll check the animals once more. Eleanor nodded, easing herself into the rocking chair near the fire. Hurry back. This looks to be a bad one. Outside, the wind cut through Jackson's coat like a knife. He worked quickly, ensuring the barn doors were securely latched, the chicken coop protected from drifting snow. As he turned back toward the cabin, a movement at the edge of the property caught his eye. A rider barely visible through the swirling snow, watching the cabin from the shelter of a stand of pines. For a moment, Jackson thought it might be the preacher, Reed, coming to check on Eleanor as promised. But something in the stillness of the figure, the deliberate way it remained half-hidden, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the weather. The rider turned away, disappearing into the storm, before Jackson could make out any details. He hurried back to the cabin, bolting the door securely behind him. Eleanor looked up as he entered, noting his expression. "What is it?" "Probably nothing," he replied, not wanting to alarm her. "Just the storm playing tricks." But as he helped her prepare for bed, then settled himself on a makeshift pallet near his sleeping sons, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After 3 years of looking over his shoulder, he developed an instinct for danger. Someone had found them. The only question was who. The blizzard raged for 2 days, confining them to the cabin. Jackson kept busy with indoor chores, repairing a leak in the roof, fixing a broken chair, showing Matthew how to whittle small toys from scraps of wood. Daniel adapted quickly to their new circumstances, chattering to Eleanor about life in the mountains, proudly showing her the wooden bear his father had carved for him months earlier. Matthew remained more reserved, watching Eleanor with cautious eyes, helping with chores but saying little. On the evening of the second day, as the storm finally began to abate, Eleanor sat by the fire with a basket of mending. Daniel had fallen asleep on a bearskin rug nearby, exhausted from a day of exploring the cabin's nooks and crannies. Matthew sat at the table with his father, learning to repair a torn boot. "Your boys are settling in well," Eleanor observed, her needle flashing in the firelight. Jackson nodded, glancing at Daniel's sleeping form. "He's always been adaptable. Matthew takes longer to trust. A valuable trait in this world." Eleanor set aside her mending with a wince. Jackson noticed immediately. "Another pain. They come and go." She rubbed her lower back. "Nothing to worry about yet." He wasn't convinced, but didn't press the issue. Instead, he asked, "How did you know about the labor law?" "It's not common knowledge." Eleanor resumed her sewing. "My husband was interested in frontier law. He kept books, papers. After he died, I read them all." She glanced up. "Knowledge is survival out here." "And the magistrate in Pine Creek, how did you persuade him to sign the document?" A small smile crossed Eleanor's face. "James treated his daughter for scarlet fever 2 winters ago. Saved her life. Some debts transcend death." Matthew had been listening to this exchange, his young face serious as he processed the adults' conversation. "Are we staying here now, Pa?" he asked suddenly. Jackson looked at his son, seeing the uncertainty behind the question. "For a while, yes. Mrs. Hayes needs help, and we need a place to stay." "Because of what happened in town when you went for food?" Jackson hesitated, unsure how much to explain. "Yes, there was a misunderstanding. They were going to hang him," Eleanor said matter-of-factly, surprising both Jackson and Matthew, "for taking food without permission. I needed help with the farm, so I offered him a chance to work instead of hanging." Matthew's eyes widened. "They were going to kill you for food." "The law is strict about theft," Jackson explained gently. "I knew the risk." The boy was silent for a long moment, processing this information. Then, with a solemnity beyond his years, he turned to Eleanor. "Thank you for saving my pa, ma'am." Eleanor's face softened. "You're welcome, Matthew." Later, after the boys were asleep in the storeroom, now cleaned and furnished with a proper pallet, Jackson found Eleanor still by the fire, her expression distant. "You didn't have to tell him," he said, taking the chair opposite of her. "He deserved the truth. Children understand more than we give them credit for." She adjusted her position with a grimace. "Besides, better he hear it from us than piece it together from half-truths." Jackson studied her face in the firelight, the question that had been bothering him for days finally finding voice. "You knew who I was, didn't you, before the hanging?" Eleanor's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "I knew of you, the mountain man with 2 boys, a man who keeps to himself." "That's not what I meant." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Finally, Eleanor sighed. "You should rest," she said, avoiding his question. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door, 3 sharp raps that cut through the quiet cabin. Jackson was on his feet instantly, hand going to the knife at his belt. "Stay here," he whispered, moving cautiously toward the door. "Who's there?" he called, one hand on the bolt. "Ezekiel Reed," came the reply, muffled by the heavy door. "I've come to check on Mrs. Hayes." Jackson glanced back at Eleanor, who nodded. He unbolted the door, opening it just enough to confirm the visitor's identity before allowing him inside. Reed stamped snow from his boots, unwinding the heavy scarf from around his neck. His eyes went immediately to Eleanor. "You're in pain," he observed, crossing to her side. "How long?" "Since yesterday," she admitted. "Nothing regular yet." The preacher frowned, then turned to Jackson. "I see you retrieved your sons." "As I said I would." Reed's gaze lingered on Jackson's face, that same flash of recognition in his eyes. "Indeed." He turned back to Eleanor. "The storm has broken. I can fetch the midwife from Pine Creek if you think it's time." Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. When it's time, I'll know." Reed didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Very well. I brought some supplies from town." He reached into his coat, producing a folded newspaper. And news. Jackson took the paper, scanning the headlines. His blood ran cold at what he saw. "Judge Reynolds arrives in redemption. Prominent Illinois jurist to oversee territorial cases." Accompanying the headline was a sketch of a face Jackson knew all too well, the man who had vowed to see him hang for the death of his son. Maxwell Reynolds had found him at last. Reed watched Jackson's reaction closely. "I thought you should know," he said quietly. "He's asking questions about mountain folk. Seems particularly interested in a man with 2 sons." Eleanor struggled to her feet, moving to Jackson's side. "When did he arrive?" "Yesterday," Reed replied. "Rode in despite the storm. Man on a mission from what I hear." Jackson's mind raced. They would have to leave immediately, take the boys and head further west into the deeper wilderness. But Eleanor was near her time and the winter was far from over. "He doesn't know we're here," Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. "Not yet." "He will," Jackson replied grimly. "Reynolds isn't a man who gives up easily." Reed looked between them, his expression thoughtful. "You know this man personally, it seems." Jackson hesitated, then gave a short nod. "We have history. The kind that might be worth discussing." Reed suggested his tone, making it clear this wasn't a casual observation. Eleanor laid a hand on Jackson's arm. "Ezekiel can be trusted," she said softly. "He knows more than you think." Before Jackson could respond, a sound from the storeroom drew their attention. Matthew stood in the doorway, his young face pale in the firelight. "Pa," he called, his voice small. "Daniel's sick, real sick." Jackson was across the room in 3 strides, pushing past Matthew into the small storeroom. Daniel lay on the pallet, his face flushed with fever, breath coming in short, labored gasps. "How long has he been like this?" Jackson demanded, kneeling beside his son. "He was coughing in his sleep," Matthew said, hovering anxiously. "Then he started breathing funny. I tried to wake him, but he wouldn't wake up proper." Jackson placed a hand on Daniel's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from the child's skin. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, Reed close behind her. "Pneumonia," Jackson said, the doctor in him assessing symptoms, even as the father in him reeled with fear. "We need to break the fever, ease his breathing." "I have medicines," Eleanor said, already moving toward a chest near her bed. James kept supplies. As she rummaged through the chest, Reed knelt beside Jackson. "You know what to do for the boy," he said quietly. "Don't you, Doctor?" "Blackwood." Jackson's head snapped up, eyes locking with the preacher's. "What did you call me? Your real name?" Reed replied calmly. "The name you bore before you came west, before Judge Reynolds began hunting you for the death of his son." For a moment, the only sound was Daniel's labored breathing. Then Eleanor returned, arms full of medical supplies. "Later, Ezekiel," she said firmly. "Right now, we need to help this child." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Jackson worked methodically, drawing on training he'd abandoned years ago. He prepared a mustard plaster for Daniel's chest, mixed willow bark tea for the fever, positioned the boy to help drainage from his lungs. Eleanor worked alongside him, her hands steady despite her own discomfort, passing instruments, preparing medicines, soothing Daniel when the treatments caused pain. Reed kept Matthew occupied, teaching the boy a simple card game at the table, though the child's eyes rarely left his brother and father. By dawn, Daniel's fever had broken, his breathing eased. He slept now, a natural healing sleep, rather than the fevered unconsciousness of the night before. Jackson sat beside him, exhausted but vigilant. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee in her hands. "You should rest," she said, offering the cup. "He's past the worst of it." Jackson accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thank you for the medicines, for your help." "You knew exactly what to do," she observed. "Every step, every treatment." He didn't respond, his eyes on Daniel's sleeping face. "Nathan," Eleanor said softly, using his real name for the first time. "I know who you are. I've known since I saw you on that gallows." Jackson Nathan looked up at her, too tired to deny it any longer. "How?" "I was a nurse during the war, in a field hospital outside Atlanta." Eleanor's voice was gentle. "You were a surgeon there, the best I ever saw." Memory stirred a crowded tent, the smell of blood and chloroform, endless rows of wounded men, and a young nurse with auburn hair, steady hands, and unflinching courage. "James was there too," Eleanor continued. "He was your assistant for a time. He wrote to me about you even after we were assigned to different hospitals." Nathan closed his eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "Then you know why I left, why I changed my name. I know you were accused of killing Judge Reynolds' son. I know you fled with your children." She paused. "What I don't know is your side of the story." Nathan looked down at Daniel, gently brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. "He broke into our home looking for morphine, an addiction from his war wounds. He threatened Sarah, she was pregnant, nearly full term. We struggled. He had a knife." His voice faltered. "I didn't mean to kill him. I was trying to protect my wife, my unborn child. And Judge Reynolds wouldn't accept that it was self-defense. His son was the last of his family line. He was devastated, consumed by grief." Nathan's expression darkened. "He used his position to make our I'd hang. We barely escaped ahead of the authorities." Eleanor touched his shoulder gently. "And now he's found you again." "It seems so." Nathan looked up at her, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. "We need to leave, as soon as Daniel is strong enough. And go where in the dead of winter with a sick child?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, there's another way." Before Nathan could ask what she meant, a sharp intake of breath made him turn. Eleanor was gripping the doorframe, her face contorted in pain. "Eleanor, I think," she said through gritted teeth, "that this baby has decided not to wait any longer." Nathan was on his feet, instantly supporting her as another contraction seized her. "How far apart?" "Close. They've been coming since midnight, but I didn't want to distract you from Daniel." She managed a strained smile. "Foolish, I know." He helped her to her bed, medical training taking over once more. "Reed," he called. "Wake Matthew. I need water-boiled clean linens." As Reed hurried to comply, Nathan turned back to Eleanor, who was breathing heavily through another contraction. "I don't suppose," she gasped, "you delivered many babies as an army surgeon." Despite the gravity of the situation, Nathan found himself smiling. "A few, though none in quite these circumstances." Eleanor gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Good thing you didn't hang then." Outside, the first rays of dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, bringing light but little warmth to the day ahead. In town, Judge Maxwell Reynolds prepared to continue his search for the man who had killed his son 3 years ago. And in the small cabin, life and death hung in a precarious balance as a new day began. Pain rippled through Eleanor's body like fire, each contraction more intense than the last. Outside, morning light spilled across the snow-covered landscape, revealing a world transformed by the storm, pristine, silent, and unforgiving. Inside the cabin, life fought to enter that same world with primal determination. "Breathe," Nathan instructed, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Slow and deep between contractions." Eleanor gripped his hand, her knuckles white. "Easy for you to say," she gasped, but followed his guidance nonetheless. Across the room, Matthew sat with Daniel, who had awakened briefly, still weak from fever, but aware enough to understand something momentous was happening. The older boy kept one protective arm around his brother's shoulders, his young face solemn with responsibility. "Is Mrs. Hayes going to die?" Matthew whispered to Reed, who was heating water on the stove. The preacher paused, choosing his words carefully. "No, son. She's bringing new life into the world. It's hard work, but your father is helping her." Matthew's eyes never left his father, the steady hands, the focused expression, the gentle confidence with which he spoke to Eleanor. This was a side of his father he'd never seen before, a glimpse of the man who had existed before their life in the mountains. Pa was a doctor, he said, not quite a question. Reed glanced at the boy, seeing the keen intelligence behind those young eyes. Yes, one of the best. Why didn't he tell us? Some truths are hard to share, even with those we love most. Reed placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder, especially when those truths might bring danger. Another cry from Eleanor drew their attention. Nathan was bent over her, speaking words too low to hear his hand supporting her back as she worked through the contraction. It's time, Nathan called to Reed. Matthew, take Daniel to the storeroom. Stay there until I call for you. Matthew hesitated, reluctant to leave when something so important was happening. But Pa, now Matthew, Nathan said, his tone brooking no argument. Your brother needs you. Recognizing the authority in his father's voice, Matthew helped Daniel to his feet, guiding him toward the storeroom. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at his father. You can do it, Pa, he said with quiet certainty. You can save them both. Something flickered in Nathan's eyes, gratitude perhaps, or resolve strengthened by his son's faith. He nodded once before turning back to Eleanor. The next hour passed in a blur of focused activity. Reed assisted as best he could, following Nathan's terse instructions, bringing cloths, water, and the medical supplies Eleanor had gathered before her labor intensified. Through it all, Eleanor fought with remarkable strength, drawing on reserves that seemed impossible for someone already exhausted from caring for others. When the final moment came, her cry of pain transformed into one of triumph as Nathan guided a tiny squirming body into the world. A girl, he announced, his voice thick with emotion. You have a daughter, Eleanor. The infant's first cry filled the cabin, indignant, powerful, a declaration of presence that brooked no denial. Nathan cleaned the baby efficiently, wrapped her in a soft blanket, and placed her in Eleanor's trembling arms. Hello, little one, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. You've certainly made an entrance. Nathan watched them for a moment, this new mother and child feeling an echo of the day Daniel had been born, the miracle tempered by loss as Sarah slipped away, despite his desperate efforts to save her. But Eleanor was strong, her color good, her bleeding minimal. She would live to see her daughter grow. She's perfect, Reed said from beside him, breaking Nathan's reverie. What will you name her? Eleanor stroked the infant's cheek with one finger. Hope, she said softly. Her name is Hope Hayes. Nathan busied himself with cleaning up, giving Eleanor time to bond with her daughter. His mind, however, was already racing ahead to the challenges they now faced. Daniel was still weak from pneumonia. Eleanor would need time to recover. And somewhere in redemption, Judge Reynolds was asking questions, coming closer to discovering their whereabouts. Matthew and Daniel can come in now, Eleanor said, adjusting her position against the pillows. They should meet Hope. Nathan called the boys, watching as they entered cautiously, eyes wide at the sight of the tiny bundle in Eleanor's arms. Is that the baby? Daniel asked, his voice still raspy from illness. Eleanor smiled. Yes, this is Hope. Would you like to see her? The boys approached the bed slowly. Matthew hung back slightly, but Daniel moved right to Eleanor's side, peering at the infant with undisguised curiosity. She's so small, he marveled. Was I that small, Pa? Even smaller, Nathan replied, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. You came earlier than expected. Matthew finally stepped closer, his expression thoughtful as he studied the newborn. She looks like you, Mrs. Hayes. Eleanor's smile deepened. Thank you, Matthew. That's a very kind thing to say. A comfortable silence settled over the cabin, a moment of peace in the midst of uncertainty. Nathan found himself wishing he could preserve it, protect these children, and all three of them now, from the harsh realities waiting beyond these walls. Reed broke the silence, his voice gentle but firm. We need to discuss what comes next, Nathan. The use of his real name didn't escape the boy's notice. Matthew's head snapped up, eyes narrowing with confusion. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yes, Matthew, that was my name, before we came to the mountains. Daniel looked between his father and brother, sensing tension, but not understanding its source. I thought you were Pa. I am Daniel. I'll always be your Pa. Nathan crouched to his son's level. But once before you were born, people called me Nathan, Dr. Nathan Blackwood. Doctor, Daniel repeated, confusion evident on his small face. Like Mr. Hayes was studying to be, Matthew said slowly, pieces falling into place. You fixed people. Nathan nodded. Yes, during the war and for a time after. Why did you stop? Daniel asked with a child's directness. Nathan glanced at Reed, then at Eleanor, who gave him an encouraging nod. Something happened, he said carefully. Something that meant we had to leave our home, change our names, start a new life in the mountains. Something Matthew pressed. Yes and no. Nathan searched for words a child could understand. I tried to protect your mother from someone who wanted to hurt her. In the struggle, the man was killed. His father, a powerful judge, believed I had murdered his son. He wouldn't listen when I tried to explain. Daniel's eyes widened. Did you go to jail? No, Daniel, we left before they could arrest me. You were just a baby. Matthew was 5. Matthew's expression had grown increasingly close, processing this revelation. So everything was a lie. Our name, where we came from, who you were. Not everything, Nathan insisted. Not the things that matter. I'm still your father. You're still my sons. We're still a family. Matthew turned away, moving to the window, his back rigid with hurt and confusion. Nathan started to follow, but Eleanor caught his eye, giving a subtle shake of her head. Give him time, she murmured. It's a lot to understand all at once. Reed cleared his throat. Perhaps now isn't the best moment for this discussion. Eleanor needs rest, and we have more immediate concerns. Nathan nodded reluctantly. You're right, Eleanor, you should sleep while the baby does. He turned to Daniel. You too, little man. Back to bed until your fever's completely gone. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but a cough interrupted him, reminding everyone of his fragile condition. He allowed himself to be led back to the storeroom, casting one last curious glance at baby Hope. Once the children were settled, Nathan and Reed stepped outside onto the porch, their breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. Reynolds won't stop looking, Reed said without preamble. He's a man consumed by a single purpose. Nathan leaned against the porch railing, eyes scanning the pristine landscape. I know. I've spent 3 years looking over my shoulder waiting for him to find me. There might be a way to end this, Reed suggested. A legal recourse. What legal recourse? Reynolds controlled the investigation, the charges, even the judge who would have presided over my trial. That's why I ran. Reed studied Nathan's profile, told him, You were a war hero, Nathan. A surgeon who saved countless lives. Surely that counts for something. Not to Reynolds. To him, I'm just the man who killed his son. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant call of a crow from the snow-laden trees. James knew, Reed said finally. Eleanor's husband. He recognized you when you passed through Pine Creek 2 years ago. He told me about it. Nathan turned sharply. Hayes saw me. Why didn't he report me? Because he believed in your innocence. He'd heard both sides of the story, served under Reynolds for a time during the war. Hayes knew Reynolds, Reed nodded. James was a meticulous record keeper. He documented everything, including things he witnessed during his time in Reynolds' unit. The preacher hesitated. Things that might give Reynolds reason to fear exposure. Before Nathan could press for details, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, moving at a steady pace through the deep snow. Get inside, Reed ordered, suddenly alert. It could be one of Reynolds' men. Nathan didn't argue, slipping back into the cabin and closing the door quietly behind him. He moved to the window, watching as Reed stepped off the porch to meet the approaching rider. The man who dismounted was unfamiliar to Nathan Young, perhaps in his 20s, wearing the rough clothes of a farmhand rather than a lawman. He spoke briefly with Reed, handed over what appeared to be a letter, then remounted and rode away without approaching the cabin. Reed returned, stamping snow from his boots before entering. His expression was grave as he handed the sealed envelope to Nathan. From Sheriff Holt, he explained, brought by his deputy's son. Nathan broke the seal, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. His face darkened as he read. What is it? Eleanor asked from the bed, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. A summons, Nathan replied grimly. I'm to present myself to the territorial magistrate in Redemption tomorrow morning. He looked up, meeting Eleanor's concerned gaze. Judge Reynolds will be presiding. Maxwell Reynolds stood at the window of the sheriff's office, watching as snow fell in lazy spirals onto the main street of Redemption. At 62, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes that had stared down countless criminals from the bench. Are you certain it was him? He asked without turning. Sheriff Holt shifted uncomfortably behind his desk. Matching the description you provided, yes. Mountain man, 2 boys, wife died in childbirth. Been living up in the hills for about 3 years. And you had him in custody? Had him on the gallows. Reynolds's voice remained measured, betraying none of the rage that had driven him across half a continent. Yet you let a woman's plea sway you from justice. The labor law is clear, Judge Reynolds. Mrs. Hayes had the proper documentation. Holt straightened in his chair, finding his backbone. I'm sworn to uphold the law, same as you. Reynolds turned, finally fixing the sheriff with a cold stare. The law Blackwood murdered my son, fled before justice could be served. That's the law I'm here to uphold. With respect, sir, that happened in Illinois, outside my jurisdiction, which is why I've brought territorial authorization to take him into custody. Reynolds withdrew a document from his coat, placing it deliberately on the sheriff's desk. Once you bring him in, of course. Holt scanned the paper, his frown deepening. This orders Dr. Blackwood's immediate arrest and transport back to Illinois. But, sir, he's technically in Mrs. Hayes's custody under the labor law. I'd need cause to violate that arrangement. A thin smile crossed Reynolds' face. Cause, how about false identity, fleeing across state lines? Or perhaps, he paused for effect. Harboring a fugitive, I understand Mrs. Hayes might have known Blackwood before their convenient arrangement. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation against a respected widow. One easily proven or disproven. When your deputy delivers the summons, we'll see what develops. Reynolds moved toward the door, adjusting his heavy coat. I've waited 3 years to see justice done, Sheriff. I won't be deterred by frontier sentimentality or legal technicalities. After Reynolds departed, Sheriff Holt remained at his desk, staring at the arrest order with a troubled expression. Finally, he opened a drawer, withdrew a bottle of whiskey, and poured himself a generous measure. The territorial judge outranked him significantly, but something about this pursuit felt personal, beyond the bounds of justice. God help those up at the Hayes place, he muttered, downing the whiskey in one swallow. Storm's coming, and it ain't just snow. Nathan sat at Eleanor's table, the summons spread before him, Reed occupying the chair opposite. They had been discussing options for nearly an hour, their voices kept low to avoid disturbing Eleanor and the children. I won't run again, Nathan said firmly. I've spent 3 years looking over my shoulder, teaching my boys to fear strangers, living half a life. If you go to redemption, Reynolds will have you arrested and transported back to Illinois for trial, Reed argued. A trial where he'll ensure the outcome. What choice do I have? If I don't appear, they'll come looking. Eleanor and the baby would be caught in the middle. Nathan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I won't put them at risk. Reed leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. What if there was evidence that could exonerate you, proof that would force even Reynolds to acknowledge your innocence? Nathan's head snapped up. What evidence? James Hayes served under Reynolds during the war. He witnessed incidents, kept records. Reed glanced toward Eleanor's bed, where she had finally fallen into exhausted sleep, hope cradled beside her. Records that could give us leverage. What kind of incidents? The kind that end military careers and reputations. Reynolds ordered an attack on a civilian settlement suspected of harboring Confederate sympathizers. Dozens died, including women and children. When questions were raised, Reynolds falsified reports blamed Confederate irregulars. Nathan absorbed this information slowly, and Hayes documented this. Reed nodded. James was meticulous, morally exacting. He couldn't participate in a cover-up, but he was a junior officer with no real power. So he recorded everything, gathered what evidence he could. After the war, he planned to bring it to light. Why didn't he? Reynolds had him transferred, then used his influence to block James's medical schooling. Made it clear any accusations would be met with devastating consequences. Reed's expression darkened. By the time James and Eleanor settled here, he was already ill with consumption. His priority became providing for Eleanor before he died. Nathan considered this new information. These records, where are they now? James entrusted them to me shortly before his death. I've kept them safe, waiting for the right moment. Reed met Nathan's gaze steadily. This might be that moment. Before Nathan could respond, a noise from the storeroom drew their attention. Matthew stood in the doorway, his young face troubled. Matthew, Nathan began, rising from his chair. You should be resting with your brother. I heard you talking, the boy said, his voice small but determined. About going back to town, about the judge who's looking for you. Nathan sighed, gesturing for his son to join them. Yes, I've been summoned to appear before the judge tomorrow. Because of what happened to Ma, because you tried to protect her. Nathan glanced at Reed, then back at his son. Yes, Judge Reynolds believes I murdered his son. He doesn't accept that it was self-defense. Matthew was quiet for a moment, processing this. Are they going to hang you this time? The directness of the question hit Nathan like a physical blow. No, he said with more confidence than he felt. Mr. Reed and I are discussing ways to prevent that. Matthew climbed onto the chair beside his father. Is that why we lived in the mountains? Why we never went to town? Because you were hiding from this judge? Yes. Nathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder. I'm sorry I kept the truth from you, Matthew. I thought I was protecting you and Daniel. The boy was silent again, his expression unreadable. Then with the simple clarity of childhood, he asked, did you do it, kill the judge's son, Chum? Yes, Nathan admitted. He broke into our home, threatened your mother. We fought, and he died from his injuries. Then it's not murder, Matthew declared with certainty. You were protecting Ma, protecting me and Daniel before he was born. Nathan felt a lump form in his throat. Some might see it differently. They're wrong. Matthew's eyes, so like his mother's, held a conviction that belied his years. You're a good man, Pa. You help people. You saved Daniel when he was sick. You helped Mrs. Hayes have her baby. Reed watched this exchange with quiet respect, recognizing the courage it took for both father and son to face hard truths together. Your father is indeed a good man, Matthew, he affirmed, and we're going to make sure the judge understands that. The conversation was interrupted by a soft cry from Hope, who had awakened hungry. Eleanor stirred, her movements slow with exhaustion. Nathan rose immediately. I'll bring her to you, he told Eleanor, crossing to lift the infant carefully. He cradled Hope with practiced ease, the tiny body fitting perfectly in his large hands as he carried her to her mother. Eleanor accepted her daughter gratefully, adjusting her position to nurse. Thank you, she murmured, then noticed Matthew at the table. Is everything all right? Matthew knows the truth, Nathan explained, about who I was, why we lived in the mountains. Eleanor studied the boy's face. That's a heavy burden for young shoulders. Matthew straightened. I'm not too young to understand, ma'am. Pa protected our family. Now it's my turn to help protect his. A smile touched Eleanor's tired face. Brave words, Matthew Blackwood. I believe you mean them. We all want to protect your father, Reed added, but adult problems require adult solutions. Your job is to look after your brother and help Mrs. Hayes with baby Hope. Matthew clearly wanted to protest, but held his tongue, recognizing the wisdom in the preacher's words. Yes, sir, he said reluctantly. A knock at the door brought everyone to attention. Nathan gestured for Matthew to stay with Eleanor as he moved cautiously to answer it, Reed close behind. The man who stood on the porch was unfamiliar, middle-aged, well-dressed, despite the harsh weather, with an air of authority that marked him as someone accustomed to respect. Dr. Blackwood, he said without preamble, or do you prefer Jackson these days? Nathan tensed, one hand still on the door, ready to slam it shut if necessary. Who's asking? Marshal Garrett, U.S. Marshal's office out of Helena. The man produced a badge from inside his coat. May I come in? This weather isn't conducive to doorstep conversations. Reed placed a restraining hand on Nathan's arm. I know him, he said quietly. He's legitimate. Nathan stepped back reluctantly, allowing the marshal to enter. Garrett stamped snow from his boots, removing his hat as he took in the cabin's interior. Eleanor with the baby Matthew hovering protectively nearby. Reed and Nathan watching him warily. Quite the domestic scene, Garrett observed, a far cry from the desperate fugitive Judge Reynolds described. Why are you here, Marshal? Nathan asked bluntly. Garrett unbuttoned his coat, revealing a holstered pistol at his hip. Officially to ensure you appear for tomorrow's hearing. Unofficially, he glanced at Reed, to deliver a message from certain parties in Helena who are concerned about Judge Reynolds' zealousness. What parties? Reed asked. People who remember the war differently than the judge would prefer. Garrett's expression remained neutral, but his meaning was clear. People who might be interested in evidence regarding Reynolds' actions during certain military operations. Nathan and Reed exchanged glances. You know about that? Reed asked carefully. Let's just say rumors persist even after all these years. Garrett turned his attention back to Nathan. Dr. Blackwood, I'm not here to arrest you or interfere with your current arrangement. but I strongly advise you to appear tomorrow as summoned. Bring whatever evidence you have regarding your case and any other matters that might be relevant. You're suggesting we use James Hayes's records, Eleanor said from across the room, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. Use them as leverage against Reynolds. Garrett studied her with new respect. I'm not suggesting anything, ma'am. I'm simply conveying that the territorial authorities would be interested in a complete accounting of events, both those in Illinois 3 years ago and those during the war. Reynolds won't back down easily, Nathan warned. He spent 3 years hunting me. Men like Reynolds believe themselves untouchable. Garrett's tone hardened slightly. Sometimes they need reminding that no one is above scrutiny. He replaced his hat, buttoning his coat. I've delivered my message. The rest is up to you. After the marshal departed, a heavy silence settled over the cabin. Nathan moved to the window, watching as Garrett's horse disappeared into the gathering dusk. Do you trust him? He asked Reed. Garrett has a reputation for fairness, the preacher replied, and he clearly knows something about Reynolds' war record. Eleanor shifted Hope to her shoulder, patting the infant's back gently. James's documents are in a compartment beneath the floorboards under our bed. He showed me before he died, made me promise to keep them safe. Nathan turned to her in surprise. You knew about them? Not the details, but I knew James had witnessed something terrible during the war, something involving Judge Reynolds. She met Nathan's gaze steadily. I also knew he believed these documents might someday help someone Reynolds had wronged. I think that someone is you. Matthew, who had been listening intently to this adult conversation, spoke up. So you can use these papers to make the judge leave Pa alone. Reed placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. It's more complicated than that, Matthew. But yes, that's the hope. Nathan moved to Eleanor's bedside, crouching to meet her eyes. I can't ask you to do this. Reynolds is powerful, vindictive. If he discovers you have evidence against him— You didn't ask, Eleanor interrupted. I'm offering. For James, who believed in justice above all. For you, who saved my daughter's life. And for myself, because I won't stand by while an innocent man is persecuted. Their eyes held for a long moment, an understanding passing between them that transcended words. Finally, Nathan nodded. Then we'll face him together, he said softly. Tomorrow in redemption. As darkness fell, Nathan sat alone on the porch, watching stars emerge in the clear night sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of snow and ice that glittered in the moonlight. In another life, he might have found beauty in the scene. Tonight, he saw only the harsh reality of what lay ahead. The door opened behind him, and Eleanor stepped out, wrapped in a heavy shawl. Hope was inside, sleeping peacefully after her evening feeding, watched over by Reed, while Matthew and Daniel slept. You should be resting, Nathan said, rising to offer her his seat. Eleanor waved him back down, leaning against the porch railing instead. I've spent enough time lying down today. Besides, my mind won't quiet. They stood in companionable silence for a time, listening to the distant hooting of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch surrendering to its burden of snow. I keep thinking about Sarah, Nathan said finally, about what she would think of all this, of the life I've given our sons. She would be proud, Eleanor said without hesitation. You've kept them safe, taught them to be strong, honest boys. You've sacrificed everything for them. Have I? Or have I simply been running, delaying the inevitable? He sighed, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. 3 years in those mountains, Eleanor. Watching them grow wild, without schooling, without friends, always afraid. You did what you had to do. Any parent would. Nathan looked up at her, this woman who had saved him from the gallows, who had given birth in the midst of crisis, who now offered to help him confront his past. How did you do it? After James died, how did you find the strength to continue? Eleanor's hand moved to her belly, still rounded from pregnancy, though now empty. I had no choice. This little one needed me to be strong. She smiled faintly, and I had James's voice in my head telling me to keep going, to build the life we'd planned together. You loved him very much. With everything I had. Her voice softened with memory. He wasn't a perfect man, too bookish, sometimes too bound by principles. But he was kind and brave in his own quiet way. He sounds like a good man. He was. Eleanor turned to face Nathan fully. He would have liked you, I think. Not just the surgeon he admired during the war, but the man you've become, the father who would do anything for his children. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared experience, shared loss, shared determination to protect what remained. Tomorrow will be dangerous, Nathan warned, feeling compelled to offer one last chance to withdraw. Reynolds won't take kindly to being threatened with exposure. All the more reason to face him together. Eleanor's voice was firm. James always said that evil thrives when good people stay silent out of fear. Nathan found himself reaching for her hand, encompassing her slender fingers in his calloused palm. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Eleanor squeezed his hand in return, the gesture conveying more than words could express. Then she glanced back at the cabin door. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will come all too soon." As they returned inside to the warmth of the cabin, neither noticed the distant figure watching from the tree line, nor the horse that turned silently to carry its rider back toward town. Dawn broke clear and cold with the rising sun casting long blue shadows across the pristine snow. Nathan stood before the small mirror in Eleanor's cabin, a borrowed razor in his hand, carefully removing 3 years of mountain life from his face. The man who emerged was both familiar and strange. Nathan Blackwood returning from exile, the haunted eyes of Jackson, the mountain man, still visible beneath the civilized exterior. Behind him, Reed was helping the boys prepare for the journey to town. Daniel, still weak from his illness, but insistent on coming, was bundled in extra layers. Matthew, solemn and watchful, dressed with unusual care, as if understanding the importance of appearances on this day. Eleanor moved about the cabin with remarkable energy for a woman who had given birth just the day before. Hope was securely wrapped and tucked into a sling across her mother's chest, her tiny face visible only as a pink bundle within the protective layers. "You shouldn't come," Nathan said, not for the first time. "You need rest. The baby needs her mother, who is perfectly capable of sitting in a wagon for the journey to town," Eleanor finished firmly. "Besides, I'm a witness to your character and I have the documents. I'm coming, Nathan." He knew better than to argue further. In the short time he'd known her, Eleanor Hayes had proven herself to be a woman of remarkable determination. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, the wagon moving slowly through the deep snow. Reed rode ahead on his horse-breaking trail, while Nathan handled the reins of Eleanor's mare. The boys sat in the back, wrapped in blankets, Daniel dozing against his brother's shoulder. The journey to redemption passed in tense silence, each adult lost in thoughts of what awaited them. As they approached the outskirts of town, Nathan felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the fugitive's instinct to flee to protect himself and his family from danger. But there was no running this time, only forward toward whatever justice they could wrest from Reynolds' grip. Redemption was unusually busy for a winter morning. Word of the hearing had spread, drawing curious townsfolk and those with nothing better to do than witness another man's troubles. Faces turned toward the wagon as it made its way down the main street, conversations pausing, fingers pointing. "They're staring at us, Pa," Daniel whispered, pressing closer to his brother. "Let them stare," Matthew replied before Nathan could answer. "We've done nothing wrong." Nathan felt a surge of pride at his son's words, even as worry gnawed at his gut. The boys shouldn't have to face this scrutiny, this public examination of their family's past. Sheriff Holt was waiting outside the town hall, his expression unreadable as the wagon came to a stop. He approached cautiously, eyeing the assembled group. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, using Nathan's real name and title with careful emphasis, "I see you've decided to bring reinforcements." "My family," Nathan corrected, jumping down from the wagon. "And friends." Holt's gaze lingered on Eleanor and the baby. "Mrs. Hayes, you should be abed. This is no place for a woman in your condition." "Thank you for your concern, Sheriff," Eleanor replied coolly, "but I'm exactly where I need to be." The sheriff shook his head slightly, then gestured toward the town hall doors. "The judge is waiting. Marshal Garrett is inside as well." Nathan helped Eleanor down from the wagon, supporting her carefully as Reed assisted the boys. Together, they climbed the steps to the town hall, a small family unit facing unknown consequences. Inside the town hall had been arranged as a makeshift courtroom. Rows of benches faced a large desk where Judge Reynolds sat, his white hair and stern countenance commanding immediate attention. To one side, Marshal Garrett stood against the wall, his posture relaxed but alert. Reynolds looked up as they entered, his eyes finding Nathan immediately. For a moment, raw emotion flashed across the judge's face, grief, rage, vindication, before his judicial mask slipped back into place. Dr. Nathan Blackwood, he intoned, his voice carrying through the now silent hall. You stand accused of the murder of Thomas Reynolds in Springfield, Illinois on April 17, 1874. You subsequently fled across state lines to escape justice, compounding your crime. How do you plead? Nathan stepped forward, conscious of his son's presence behind him. Not guilty by reason of self-defense, Your Honor. A murmur ran through the assembled townspeople. Reynolds's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Self-defense, he repeated, skepticism dripping from each syllable. My son was unarmed when you killed him. Your son broke into my home in the middle of the night, Nathan replied steadily. He was armed with a knife. He threatened my pregnant wife. In the struggle to disarm him, he was fatally wounded. Convenient claims from a man who fled rather than face a proper trial. Reynolds's gaze shifted to Eleanor and the children. And you've brought witnesses to support these claims, a woman you saved from the gallows and 2 children too young to understand the proceedings. Reed stepped forward. If it please the court, you have evidence pertinent to this case. Reynolds regarded the preacher with cold disdain. You have evidence regarding events that occurred 3 years ago in Illinois, events you did not witness. I have evidence regarding your conduct during the war. Judge Reynolds, Reed replied evenly. Conduct that speaks directly to your credibility in this matter and your fitness to preside over any case involving Dr. Blackwood. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Reynolds' face paled, then flushed with anger. This proceeding concerns a murder charge, nothing more, he snapped. Your attempt to introduce irrelevant material is noted and dismissed. Marshal Garrett pushed away from the wall, stepping forward. With respect, Judge, the territorial authority has an interest in ensuring all relevant facts are examined. If Reverend Reed has documentation that might speak to potential bias or misconduct, it falls within the scope of this hearing. Reynolds' eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you questioning my authority, Marshal? I'm upholding mine, Garrett replied mildly. As representative of the territorial government, I have a duty to ensure justice is administered fairly. A tense silence fell over the room. Nathan could feel the weight of what was happening, a power struggle with his freedom, possibly his life hanging in the balance. Eleanor moved forward, hope still cradled against her chest. Judge Reynolds, she said, her voice clear and steady, my late husband served under your command during the war. He was a conscientious man, dedicated to truth. Reynolds' attention shifted to her recognition dawning in his eyes. Hayes, he muttered, the medical assistant who couldn't follow orders. The medical assistant who couldn't participate in a cover-up, Eleanor corrected. The man who documented your order to attack a civilian settlement, resulting in dozens of deaths, including women and children. The man who preserved evidence of your falsified reports blaming Confederate forces for the massacre. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Reynolds slammed his gavel down repeatedly, his face contorted with rage. This is outrageous, he bellowed. Slanderous accusations with no bearing on the matter at hand. On the contrary, Reed interjected, producing a leather portfolio from inside his coat. These documents establish a pattern of abuse of power, of manipulating justice to serve personal ends. They demonstrate that you are willing to sacrifice truth and lives to protect your reputation. Reynolds rose from his seat, pointing a trembling finger at Reed. I will not be lectured on justice by a backwater preacher and a fugitive murderer. Perhaps you'd prefer to be lectured by the territorial governor. Marshal Garrett suggested, his calm demeanor, a stark contrast to Reynolds' fury. I'm authorized to take these documents to Helena if this matter cannot be resolved satisfactorily here. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Reynolds' face. He sank back into his chair, visibly calculating his options. Nathan stepped forward again, his voice low, but carrying in the hushed room. Judge Reynolds, I never intended to kill your son. I was protecting my family from harm. I understand your grief. I've lost someone I love too. But this pursuit, this vendetta has gone on long enough. You dare speak of grief, Reynolds' voice broke slightly. You took my only child, my legacy. And in return, you've spent 3 years trying to take me from my sons. Nathan gestured toward Matthew and Daniel, who stood wide-eyed but resolute beside Eleanor. They've already lost their mother. Would justice truly be served by making them orphans? A heavy silence fell over the room. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Then Hope, as if sensing the pivotal moment, let out a plaintive cry from her sling. The sound, new life asserting itself in the midst of old grievances, seemed to break the tension. Reynolds stared at the infant, then at the two boys, his expression complicated by emotions too tangled to name. Finally, he looked back at Nathan. "You claim self-defense," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "You maintain my son threatened your wife with a knife." "Yes," Nathan confirmed. "Thomas was not himself. The war left him with injuries, pain. He became dependent on morphine. That night, he was desperate, irrational." Something shifted in Reynolds' eyes, recognition, perhaps, of a truth he had long denied. "He was changed after the war," he admitted quietly. "I thought it was just adjustment, that he needed time." Marshal Garrett moved closer to the judge's table. "Your Honor, in light of the complicated nature of this case, I suggest a compromise. The Territorial Authority is prepared to officially close this matter. No charges against Dr. Blackwood, no further pursuit in exchange for discretion regarding the war records currently in Reverend Reed's possession." Reynolds' gaze moved from the marshal to Reed to the portfolio containing James Hayes's damning documentation. His shoulders sagged, almost imperceptibly. "You're blackmailing a federal judge," he said, but the fire had gone out of his voice. "I'm offering a path forward," Garrett corrected, "one that allows everyone to retain their dignity and get on with their lives." For several long moments, Reynolds sat in silence, the weight of 3 years of grief and rage visibly pressing upon him. Finally, he straightened his judicial mask firmly back in place. "In the matter of the state of Illinois versus Dr. Nathan Blackwood," he pronounced formally, "this court finds insufficient evidence to proceed with charges. The case is dismissed." He fixed Nathan with a hard stare. "Consider yourself fortunate, doctor. Not every man gets a second chance at life." Relief washed over Nathan in a dizzying wave. Behind him, he heard Daniel's excited whisper to his brother, felt Eleanor's hand touch his arm in silent support. "Thank you, Your Honor." He managed his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Reynolds rose, gathering his papers. "This hearing is concluded." He paused, glancing at the portfolio in Reed's hands. "I trust those documents will be secure, Reverend, for everyone's sake." "They'll be preserved," Reed assured him, "and accessed only if circumstances require." With a curt nod, Reynolds strode from the room, his back rigid with wounded pride, but his vendetta at last abandoned. The townspeople began to disperse, buzzing with excited conversation about what they had witnessed. Sheriff Holt approached, his expression a mix of relief and caution. "Well, that's that," he said awkwardly. "I suppose you're free to go, Dr. Blackwood." "Free?" Nathan repeated the word, feeling foreign on his tongue after so many years of running. "Yes, I suppose I am." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, Hope now quiet in her sling. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. "Return to Illinois." Nathan looked at his sons, at Reed, and finally at Eleanor with her newborn daughter. The people who had stood with him, who had risked themselves to help him find justice. "No," he said with sudden certainty. "There's nothing for us there anymore. Our home is here now." He didn't say what he was thinking, that home had become less about a place and more about the people surrounding him. That somewhere in the chaos of the past few days, bonds had formed that felt more real than any he'd known since Sarah's death. Matthew tugged at his sleeve. "Does this mean we don't have to hide anymore, Pa? We can live in a real house, go to school." Nathan crouched to his son's level, placing a hand on each boy's shoulder. "Yes, Matthew, no more hiding, no more running. We can build a proper life now." Daniel's face lit up with excitement. "Can we stay with Mrs. Hayes? I like it there. And baby Hope needs someone to teach her things, like how to fish and track rabbits." Eleanor laughed softly, the sound brightening the somber town hall. "I think Hope is a bit young for fishing lessons, Daniel. But yes, you're all welcome to stay as long as you need." Nathan stood, meeting Eleanor's gaze over the children's heads. "We have a lot to talk about," he said quietly, "a lot to figure out." "We do," she agreed, "but not today. Today is for celebrating freedom and new beginnings." As they stepped out of the town hall into the bright winter sunshine, Nathan felt the weight of the past 3 years begin to lift. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenges, difficult conversations, but also possibility. The chance to be Nathan Blackwood again, to practice medicine, to raise his sons in peace, and perhaps, just perhaps, to build something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Reed joined them as they walked toward the wagon, his expression satisfied. "I believe this calls for a proper meal," he suggested. "The hotel serves a decent stew, and I'm sure they can find room for our party." "Can we, Pa?" Daniel asked eagerly. "I've never eaten in a hotel before." Nathan lifted his younger son into his arms, feeling the boy's weight, still too light but recovering. "Yes, we can. Today is a day for firsts." As they made their way down the street, the citizens of Redemption watched with curious eyes, not a fugitive, and his wild mountain children now but a doctor, a family potential neighbors. Nathan nodded politely to those they passed, no longer afraid to be seen to be known. Behind them in the shadow of the town hall doorway, Marshal Garrett observed their departure with quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served today, not the vengeful kind Reynolds had sought for 3 years, but the balanced measure that allowed for healing for second chances. "Godspeed, Dr. Blackwood," he murmured, before turning to mount his horse for the long ride back to Helena. "Make good use of your freedom." Hope stirred in her sling, one tiny hand escaping the blankets to catch a sunbeam. Eleanor tucked it gently back, whispering words of love to her daughter. Beside her, Nathan walked with his step lighter than it had been in years. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise, a path no longer defined by fear and flight, but by the courage to begin again together. The weeks following the hearing passed in a blur of quiet activity. Winter maintained its grip on the Montana landscape, but within Eleanor's cabin, warmth and new routines took hold. Nathan and his boys had stayed occupying the storeroom that had been transformed into a proper sleeping area, with beds crafted from lumber salvaged from an abandoned homestead nearby. Daniel had recovered fully from his pneumonia, his cheeks regaining their color as he raced around the cabin with boundless energy, eager to help with chores and constantly asking questions about baby Hope. Matthew remained more reserved, watching the adults with thoughtful eyes, but the rigid wariness that had characterized him for so long had begun to soften. For Nathan, the freedom from pursuit brought changes both profound and subtle. He stood straighter, smiled more readily, spoke of the future as something to anticipate rather than fear. He had begun providing medical care to neighboring homesteaders, his reputation spreading through the scattered community as word traveled of a skilled doctor settling in their remote corner of the territory. Eleanor had recovered from childbirth with remarkable swiftness, her natural strength reasserting itself as she cared for Hope and managed the homestead. She and Nathan fell into an easy partnership, dividing tasks, consulting each other on decisions, sharing quiet conversations by the fire after the children were asleep. On a clear February morning, Nathan stood on the porch watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. The sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, and in the distance, he could see Matthew teaching Daniel how to check the rabbit snares they had set the previous day. The door opened behind him, and Eleanor stepped out, Hope bundled against her chest in a sling. "They're becoming proper frontier boys," she observed, following his gaze to where the brothers worked together. Nathan nodded. "Matthew's taken to it naturally. He's always been responsible, but now," he paused, searching for words, "now he's doing it from choice, not fear." Eleanor moved to stand beside him, adjusting Hope's blanket against the cold. "And what about their father? What is he doing from choice these days?" The question hung in the air between them, layered with meaning. Nathan turned to study her face, cheeks flushed with cold, eyes clear and direct, a strand of auburn hair escaping her bonnet to dance in the winter breeze. "Building something," he answered finally, "or trying to." Eleanor held his gaze steadily. "And what exactly are you building, Dr. Blackwood?" Before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Reed appeared on the trail, his horse moving at a steady pace through the snow. He raised a hand in greeting as he approached. "Visitors," Eleanor remarked. "Our quiet morning is at an end." Reed dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to long rides, tethering his horse to the porch rail. "Good morning," he called, climbing the steps to join them. "I bring news and mail from town." "Mail?" Eleanor looked surprised. "For me, and for the good doctor." Reed produced several envelopes from inside his coat. "Word travels, it seems, even to these remote parts." Nathan accepted the letters curiously. The top envelope bore the seal of the Montana Territorial Medical Board, addressed formally to Dr. Nathan Blackwood. The second was from Marshal Garrett. "Come inside," Eleanor invited. "I've coffee on the stove and you look half frozen." In the warmth of the cabin, Reed gratefully accepted a steaming cup, warming his hands around it before speaking. There's talk in town, he began, about Judge Reynolds' hasty departure, about Dr. Blackwood's innocence, about the need for a physician in these parts. Nathan, who had been examining his letters without opening them, looked up sharply. What kind of talk? The constructive kind. Reed took a sip of coffee. Sheriff Holt approached me yesterday. The town council is considering a proposal to establish a proper medical clinic in Redemption. They're seeking a qualified doctor to staff it. Eleanor, who had settled in the rocking chair with hope, raised an eyebrow. And they're considering Nathan, boys. He's their first choice, assuming he's interested. Reed nodded toward the unopened letter. I suspect that's what the territorial board is writing about. Nathan stared at the envelope in his hands. After years of hiding, of suppressing his medical training, except in emergencies, the thought of practicing openly again seemed almost unreal. I don't know, he said slowly. Redemption hasn't exactly been welcoming to my family. Perceptions change, Reed observed. You're no longer the mountain man stealing food, but Dr. Blackwood unjustly accused and now exonerated. Your skills are already in demand among the outlying homesteads. The town simply wants to formalize the arrangement. Eleanor watched Nathan's face, reading the conflict there. It would mean moving to town, she said quietly, leaving this place. Reed glanced between them, sensing undercurrents. Not necessarily. Many doctors ride circuits visiting outlying areas. You could maintain your base here and travel to town as needed. Nathan finally opened the letter from the medical board. He scanned it quickly, his expression growing more serious as he read. They've reviewed my credentials, he said, confirmed my medical license is valid in the territory. They're offering provisional approval to establish a practice pending a formal interview in Helena next month. That's wonderful news, Eleanor said, though something in her tone suggested mixed emotions. Nathan set the letter aside and opened the second envelope. A brief note from Marshal Garrett informed him that Judge Reynolds had returned to Illinois, his reputation intact but his vendetta officially abandoned. The territorial authorities considered the matter closed. Freedom. True freedom, not just from pursuit, but from the shadow of the past. Nathan felt the weight of it settle around him, not a burden, but a responsibility, a chance to reclaim the life and purpose he had abandoned 3 years ago. Matthew and Daniel burst through the door, then cheeks red with cold eyes bright with excitement. Pa, we got 2 rabbits, Daniel announced triumphantly, holding up their catch. Matthew showed me how to reset the snares just like you taught him. Well done, Nathan praised, tucking the letters into his pocket as he examined their prize. That's dinner sorted then. Matthew noticed Reed and gave a polite nod. Morning, Reverend. Good morning, Matthew. Successful hunting, I see. Eleanor rose from the rocking chair. Why don't you boys help me prepare them? Nathan and Reverend Reed have matters to discuss. As Eleanor led the boys toward the kitchen area, Reed moved closer to Nathan, lowering his voice. There's something else. Something not in those letters. Nathan's instincts, honed by years of vigilance, immediately sharpened. What is it? Nothing threatening, Reed assured him quickly, but potentially significant. There's a family that arrived in town last week. The woman is ill consumption advanced stages. Her husband mentioned they were searching for a Dr. Blackwood, that they had traveled from Illinois hoping to find him. Who are they? Nathan asked, his mind racing through possibilities. Their name is Wilson. The husband is a former Union Army captain. He says you treated him during the war, saved his leg when other surgeons wanted to amputate. Nathan's expression cleared with recognition. Robert Wilson. Yes, I remember him. Many a ball to the femur complex fracture. We used a new technique, immobilized the leg instead of removing it. He frowned. But why search for me after all these years? According to Wilson, his wife Elizabeth has been corresponding with your sister-in-law, Sarah's sister. When they learned of Elizabeth's diagnosis and the Wilsons' plan to move west for her health, she suggested they seek you out. Nathan sat down heavily, the implications of this news washing over him. Sarah's sister never gave up looking for us, he murmured. Even after all this time. Apparently not, Reed confirmed. The Wilsons didn't know about your legal difficulties. They were surprised to discover you living as a mountain man under a different name. Does the whole town know now? Only that you've been found and cleared of all charges. The details remain private. Reed hesitated. They're staying at the hotel in Redemption. Wilson is quite weak, but she's asking for you specifically. Her husband believes only you can help her. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, thinking of the dying woman who had traveled so far on the slim hope of finding him. I'll need to go to town, he said finally. Tomorrow if the weather holds. I thought you might say that. Reed smiled slightly. I've already told them to expect you. From the kitchen area, Eleanor watched this exchange, her hands busy with the rabbits, but her attention focused on Nathan's troubled expression. Something had shifted, and she felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation of change approaching, of foundations trembling beneath carefully constructed peace. That evening, after the children were asleep and Reed had departed for town with a promise to inform the Wilsons of Nathan's impending visit, Nathan and Eleanor sat before the fire. Hope slept peacefully in a cradle Nathan had crafted during the past weeks, a gift that had brought tears to Eleanor's eyes when he presented it. You're worried about tomorrow, Eleanor observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Nathan stared into the flames, his thoughts clearly far away. Not worried exactly, just unsettled. This connection to my past appearing now when everything seemed to be settling into place. Do you think this Mrs. Wilson can be helped? Without examining her, it's hard to say. Consumption in advanced stages offers few treatment options. Nathan's expression darkened. I've seen too many cases end the same way despite everything medical science can offer. Eleanor studied his profile, the firelight casting half his face in shadow. It's not just her condition that concerns you, though, is it? It's the connection to Sarah's family. Nathan nodded slowly. Her sister Catherine never approved of our move west after the war. She thought I was taking Sarah too far from family, from civilization. When Sarah died, he paused, swallowing hard. Catherine wanted to take the boys, raise them properly, as she put it. And you refused. They were all I had left of Sarah, and I was their father, grieving, yes, but still capable of raising my own sons. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Then Reynolds' son broke in, everything fell apart, and we were running before I could even consider reaching out to her. Eleanor reached across the space between their chairs, placing her hand over his. She must have loved them very much to keep searching all these years. Yes, Nathan turned his hand to clasp hers, a gesture that had become increasingly natural between them. I wonder what she told the Wilsons, what they're expecting to find. They'll find a good man, Eleanor said with quiet certainty. A skilled doctor, a devoted father. The rest is just details. Nathan's eyes met hers, filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. For a long moment they sat in silence, hands joined, the only sounds the crackling fire and Hope's soft breathing from her cradle. The town council's offer, Eleanor said finally. Will you consider it? I don't know. Nathan released her hand, gently rising to add another log to the fire. Part of me wants to return to medicine fully, not just treating neighbors as favors, but establishing a proper practice. The boys deserve stability, education. But, he turned to face her, his expression troubled. But it would mean changes, for all of us. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. What exactly did all of us encompass? The past weeks had created a unit of sorts. Nathan and his sons, Eleanor and Hope, living and working together out of necessity and mutual benefit. But with Nathan's name cleared, with opportunities opening before him, those practical arrangements required redefinition. Change isn't always unwelcome, Eleanor said carefully. Sometimes it's simply the natural progression of things. And sometimes it means leaving behind something valuable for an uncertain future. Nathan's voice was equally measured. Eleanor, these past weeks. A small cry from Hope's cradle interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Eleanor rose immediately, lifting the infant and cradling her against her shoulder. She's hungry, she murmured, the moment between them broken. I should feed her and get some rest. Tomorrow will be an early start if you are riding to town. Nathan nodded, stepping back to give her space. Of course, I'll check on the boys before turning in. As Eleanor moved toward her curtained sleeping area with Hope, she paused, looking back at him. Nathan, she said softly, whatever you decide about the town's offer about the future, know that you and the boys will always have a place here. This is your home too now. The simple declaration, offered without pressure or expectation, touched something deep within him. Thank you, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. For everything. She smiled, a small, private smile that seemed to acknowledge all that remained unspoken between them before disappearing behind the curtain. Nathan stood alone by the fire for a long time afterward, watching the flames dance and thinking of paths not taken, of opportunities lost and found, of the strange twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, he allowed himself to simply exist in this place of safety and belonging that had been so unexpectedly granted to him. Redemption looked different somehow. As Nathan rode into town the following morning, the streets were still muddy with melting snow, the buildings still weathered and utilitarian, but his perception had shifted. This was no longer a place of danger of judgment, but simply a frontier town, like dozens of others, people trying to build lives in a harsh land, supporting each other through necessity as much as choice. Several townsfolk nodded in greeting as he passed, recognition and a new respect in their eyes. Word had clearly spread about his exoneration, about his identity as a physician. Outside the general store, he spotted Sheriff Holt, who touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that fell somewhere between acknowledgement and apology. The hotel stood at the end of the main street, a two-story wooden structure with pretensions of grandeur in its painted sign and curtain windows. Nathan tethered his horse at the hitching post, taking a moment to compose himself before entering. The lobby was modestly furnished, but clean, with a small fire burning in the hearth and a desk where a middle-aged woman looked up from her ledger as he entered. "Dr. Blackwood," she greeted him, surprising him with her immediate recognition. "The Wilsons are expecting you. Room 3, top of the stairs." Nathan thanked her, climbing the narrow staircase with a sense of stepping into the past. How many sick rooms had he entered during the war? How many desperate families had looked to him for miracles he couldn't always provide? He knocked gently on the door marked with a brass numeral. It opened almost immediately, revealing a tall man with graying hair and the straight-backed posture of a career military officer. Despite the passing years, Nathan recognized him instantly. "Captain Wilson." "Dr. Blackwood." The man's weathered face broke into a smile of genuine pleasure. "Or I suppose it's just Mr. Wilson now, as it's just Dr. Blackwood again." They shook hands warmly, the shared past creating an immediate connection that transcended the years between. "Please come in," Wilson said, stepping back from the doorway. "Elizabeth has been so eager to see you." The hotel room was small but comfortable, dominated by a large bed where a woman reclined against pillows, a quilt drawn up to her waist despite the fire burning in the small grate. Her face was gaunt, cheeks flushed with the characteristic fever of consumption, but her eyes were clear and intelligent as they fixed on Nathan. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You're really here." Robert wasn't imagining things. Nathan approached the bedside medical assessment already underway as he noted her labored breathing, the slight bluish tinge to her lips, the way her collarbones stood out sharply beneath her nightgown. "Mrs. Wilson," he greeted her, taking the chair her husband placed beside the bed. "I understand you've come a long way to find me." "Catherine was right," Elizabeth said, studying his face intently. "You haven't changed so much despite everything. Still the same kind eyes." Nathan felt a tightening in his chest at the mention of Sarah's sister. "You've been in contact with Catherine for years." Elizabeth's hand moved to a small leather case on the bedside table. "She never stopped looking for you and the boys. When she learned we were moving west for my health, she asked us to watch for any sign of you." Wilson moved to stand behind his wife, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "Pure coincidence that my old war wounds started troubling me as we traveled," he explained. "I mentioned to a fellow passenger that I wished my old surgeon from Antietam was available. One thing led to another, and we heard rumors of a Dr. Blackwood recently surfaced in Montana territory. Catherine will be overjoyed to know we've found you," Elizabeth added, then was overtaken by a coughing spell that left her gasping for breath. Nathan reached for her wrist, automatically counting her rapid pulse as he waited for the coughing to subside. "Let's focus on you for the moment," he said gently. "How long have you been ill?" The examination that followed confirmed what Nathan had suspected from the first moment. Elizabeth Wilson's consumption was far advanced, both lungs severely compromised. Her heart strained from the effort of supplying her body with insufficient oxygen. The journey west undertaken partly in hope of finding Nathan, and partly because the dry mountain air sometimes helped consumption, patience had accelerated the disease's progress. "How long?" Wilson asked bluntly when Nathan had completed his examination and Elizabeth had drifted into an exhausted sleep. Nathan led the man to the far corner of the room, keeping his voice low. "Weeks, perhaps a month or two at most." "I'm sorry, Robert. If I'd seen her earlier." You'd have told us the same thing every other doctor did. Wilson interrupted his military bearing, giving way to the slumped shoulders of a man facing inevitable loss. I knew when we started this journey that it was a final adventure for us, not a cure. Elizabeth insisted on coming, though, said if she was going to die, she'd rather do it under an open sky than in a stuffy Illinois bedroom. Nathan placed a hand on the man's shoulder, recognizing the grief already beginning its work. I can give her medications to ease the breathing, to help with pain when it comes. Make her comfortable. That's all anyone can do now. Wilson agreed, his gaze returning to his sleeping wife. But there's something else, Nathan. Something beyond medical help. Elizabeth promised Catherine she would deliver a message if we found you. And there are letters, years of them, that Catherine has written to you and the boys. He moved to a trunk positioned at the foot of the bed, unlocking it and withdrawing a packet wrapped in oilcloth. Catherine wants to see her nephews, he said, handing the packet to Nathan. She wants to know her sister's sons. Not to take them from you, she understands now that was wrong, but to be family to them, to tell them stories of their mother as a girl, to give them the connection to Sarah that only she can provide. Nathan stared at the packet in his hands, feeling the weight of years and unspoken words contained within. I never meant to cut them off from her, he said quietly. Everything happened so quickly. The accident, the charges, the flight west. She knows that now. Wilson's expression softened. Read the letters, Nathan. Consider allowing her to visit when the weather improves. That's all she asks. Nathan nodded slowly, tucking the packet inside his coat. I will, and I'll return tomorrow with medicines for Elizabeth, some preparations that might make her more comfortable. As he turned to leave, Elizabeth stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Doctor, she called weakly, tell Catherine. Tell her I kept my promise. I found her family. Rest now, Nathan told her gently. I'll make sure she knows. Outside in the clear winter air, Nathan stood for a moment on the hotel porch, the packet of letters, a tangible weight against his chest. Another link to his past had surfaced, another decision to be made about the future he was rebuilding. He was so deep in thought that he almost missed the small figure huddled on a bench at the far end of the porch. A closer look revealed Matthew, arms wrapped around himself for warmth, watching his father with anxious eyes. Matthew, Nathan crossed to his son in quick strides. What are you doing here? How did you get to town? I hid in the back of Reverend Reed's wagon when he left this morning, the boy admitted. I wanted to see the town, to see where you were going. Nathan sat beside his son, concern warring with understanding. You should have asked. Eleanor will be worried sick. She knows. I left a note. Matthew looked down at his boots. I heard you and Reverend Reed talking yesterday about the sick lady, about Ma's sister. I wanted to know what was happening. Nathan sighed, recognizing the need for honesty. Mrs. Wilson is very ill, Matthew. She and her husband knew me during the war, and they've been in contact with your Aunt Catherine, your mother's sister. The one who wanted to take us away after Ma died. Yes. Nathan was continually surprised by how much Matthew remembered, how closely he observed the adult world. But she doesn't want that anymore. She just wants to know you and Daniel to be part of our family again. Matthew considered this, his young face serious. Is that why we're going to move to town, because of Ma's sister? Who said we're moving to town? I heard you and Mrs. Hayes talking. Matthew met his father's eyes directly. About the doctor job, about changes coming. Nathan placed an arm around his son's shoulders, drawing him close. Nothing has been decided yet, Matthew, and nothing will be decided without talking to you and Daniel first. You're not just children to be moved around at adult whims. You're my sons, and your opinions matter to me. Some of the tension left Matthew's small frame. I like it at Mrs. Hayes's farm, he said after a moment. I like helping with the animals, and Daniel is happy there, and baby Hope needs someone to watch out for her. You've become quite protective of Hope, Nathan observed with a smile. Matthew nodded solemnly. She's so little, like Daniel was when Ma died. Somebody has to look after her while Mrs. Hayes does the farm work. The simple statement, delivered with a child's straightforward logic, touched Nathan deeply. His sons had been through so much lost flight, years of isolation, yet they remained capable of such compassion, such connection to others. What would you think, he asked carefully, if we didn't just stay as guests at Mrs. Hayes's farm, but made it our home permanently? If Mrs. Hayes and Hope became part of our family? Matthew's eyes widened as he processed the implication. You mean marry Mrs. Hayes like you were married to Ma? Yes, Nathan confirmed the idea, crystallizing as he spoke it aloud for the first time. Not to replace your mother, no one could ever do that, but to build something new, a family for all of us. For a long moment, Matthew was silent, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. Finally, he said, I think Ma would want you to be happy. And Daniel and me too. He hesitated, then added with childlike directness, do you love Mrs. Hayes? The question, so simple yet so profound, caught Nathan off guard. Did he love Eleanor? The woman who had saved him from the gallows, who had opened her home to his family, who had shown such strength and compassion through extraordinary circumstances. Yes, he said, the truth of it settling in his heart. I believe I do. Not the same way I loved your mother. That was a love that grew over many years. But a real love nonetheless, one that could grow into something lasting. Matthew nodded, accepting this with the remarkable adaptability of childhood. Then you should tell her, before she thinks we're leaving because of the doctor job in town. Nathan smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. When did you get so wise, Matthew Blackwood? The boy shrugged, a hint of a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. Somebody has to think about these things. Daniel's too busy chasing chickens. Nathan laughed, pulling his son into a proper hug. Let's find Reverend Shreed and see if he's ready to head back to the farm. I think we both have something important to tell Mrs. Hayes. As they walked down the hotel steps into the winter sunshine, Nathan felt a sense of clarity that had eluded him for years. The past would always be part of him. Sarah's memory, the tragedy that had sent them fleeing west, the years of hiding, but it no longer defined his future. That future was walking beside him in the form of a serious 8-year-old boy, waiting back at the farm in the exuberant energy of a 6-year-old crying for attention, in the newborn wails of a baby girl. And perhaps if he found the courage to ask, and she found the willingness to accept, that future included Eleanor Hayes as well. Eleanor stood on the porch, scanning the horizon for any sign of Reed's wagon returning with Nathan and Matthew. The boy's note, discovered shortly after breakfast, had sent a spike of worry through her, though she understood his curiosity and concern about his father's activities. Hope fussed in her cradle inside, responding to her mother's anxiety, despite Eleanor's attempts to maintain a calm demeanor. Daniel, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult tension, had spent the morning constructing an elaborate fort from twigs in the yard, occasionally running inside to warm his hands by the fire. They'll be back soon, she told herself firmly, refusing to acknowledge the deeper fear that had taken root since Nathan's conversation with Reed the previous day. The fear that this fragile arrangement, this family they had begun to build, might be coming to an end. The town council's offer, the connection to Sarah's family, the possibility of Nathan returning to his former life as a respected physician, all pointed toward changes that might take him and the boys away from the isolated farm that had become home to all of them. Mrs. Hayes, Daniel's excited voice broke through her thoughts. They're coming. I see the wagon. Eleanor shaded her eyes against the winter sun, spotting Reed's wagon in the distance, moving steadily along the snow-packed trail. Relief flooded through her at the sight of 2 figures on the bench, Reed driving Nathan beside him. Where was Matthew? As the wagon drew closer, she spotted the boy perched in the back, bundled in blankets, but clearly enjoying the ride. His face lit up when he saw her on the porch, and he waved enthusiastically. Eleanor waved back, feeling the tightness in her chest ease slightly. Whatever news Nathan brought from town, at least everyone was returning safely. Daniel raced to meet the wagon as it pulled up before the cabin, his fort forgotten in the excitement of his brother's adventure and return. Did you see the town? Did Pa let you go into the store? Did you get candy? Matthew jumped down, greeting his brother with the superior air of one who has experienced grand adventures. I saw everything, the hotel, the jail, the general store, and I met a lady who knew Ma's family. Eleanor's eyes met Nathan's as he approached the porch, reading the mixture of emotions in his expression, weariness, concern, but also something else, a determination that hadn't been there when he left that morning. Elizabeth Wilson is dying, he said without preamble, his voice low enough that the boys, now engaged in animated conversation about Matthew's adventure, couldn't hear. Consumption advanced stages. She has a month at most. I'm sorry, Eleanor replied, genuine sympathy in her tone. For her and for her husband. And for you having to deliver such news. Nathan nodded, his gaze moving to the boys, then back to Eleanor. There's more. They've been in contact with Sarah's sister, Catherine. She's been searching for us all these years. Elizabeth promised to deliver a message if they found us. And the message? That Catherine wants to know her nephews, not to take them from me, but to be family to them, to give them a connection to their mother. Nathan reached inside his coat, withdrawing the packet of letters. She's written to us for years, never knowing if the letters would reach us. Eleanor studied his face, trying to gauge his reaction to this development. How do you feel about her reaching out after all this time? Relieved, he admitted. Guilty for cutting the boys off from their mother's family, even if it wasn't intentional. Uncertain about what it means for our future. Our future, Eleanor repeated softly, the phrase hanging between them with all its ambiguity. Nathan stepped closer, lowering his voice further. Eleanor, there's something I need to ask you. Something I've been considering for weeks now, but couldn't find the right moment or words. Her heart quickened, but before he could continue, Reed approached from the wagon, his expression apologetic. I hate to interrupt, he said, but there's a situation developing in town that I thought you should know about immediately. Nathan turned to the preacher with barely concealed frustration. What situation? Robert Wilson collapsed about an hour after you left the hotel. Heart failure from what the barber surgeon could determine. He's asking for you, specifically Nathan. Wilson, Nathan's expression shifted to professional concern. He seemed tired but stable when I left them. Apparently the strain of the journey combined with worry over his wife proved too much. Reed glanced at Eleanor. I'm sorry to disrupt your homecoming, but I promised I'd bring Dr. Blackwood back as quickly as possible. Nathan looked torn, his gaze moving from Eleanor to the children playing in the yard, then back to Reed. I have to go, he said, the doctor, in him already calculating what supplies he might need. Wilson was a good man, a brave officer. I owe him what help I can provide. Of course you must go, Eleanor agreed, masking her disappointment with practicality. I'll prepare some food for you to take back. The boys and I will manage here. Matthew should stay this time, Nathan said with a firm glance toward his older son, who had the grace to look slightly abashed at his earlier escapade. I'll return as soon as I can. As Nathan gathered medical supplies from the chest Eleanor had shown him weeks earlier, Reed helped her pack bread, cheese, and cold meat for the return journey. He was about to say something important, Reed observed quietly as they worked, before I interrupted with news of Wilson. Eleanor kept her eyes on the food she was wrapping. Perhaps you misread the moment. I don't think so. Reed studied her profile. Nathan Blackwood is a man who knows his mind, Eleanor, and his heart. Whatever he was about to say, he'll find another moment to say it. Unless circumstances change, she replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. Unless the pull of his former life, his profession, proves stronger than what we built here. Reed's expression softened with understanding. Faith sometimes requires patience, Eleanor, and trust in foundations carefully laid. Before she could respond, Nathan returned with his medical bag, James's bag really, which Eleanor had preserved along with his supplies and books. The sight of Nathan carrying it with such natural authority brought an unexpected lump to her throat. This was who he truly was, Dr. Nathan Blackwood, healer, man of science and compassion. I'll return by tomorrow if possible, he told her, buckling the bag closed. Earlier if Wilson's condition stabilizes quickly. Eleanor nodded, handing him the package of food. The boys and I will be fine. Hope has been sleeping better at night, and Daniel promised to help with the chickens tomorrow morning. Their eyes met, a world of unspoken thoughts passing between them. Then Nathan surprised her by taking her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll finish our conversation when I return, he said, his voice low but firm with promise. There are things that need saying, Eleanor. Important things. She returned the pressure of his hand briefly before releasing it. I'll be here. As she watched the wagon depart once more, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of anxiety and hope. Whatever Nathan had been about to say before Reed's interruption, his parting words suggested it hadn't been forgotten or reconsidered. Mrs. Hayes, Matthew appeared at her side, his expression serious. Pa will come back, you know. He always keeps his promises. Eleanor smiled down at the boy, touched by his attempt to reassure her. I know he does, Matthew. Your father is a man of his word. And he has something real important to tell you, the boy added with the air of one privy to significant secrets. So you shouldn't worry about him not coming back. Before Eleanor could question this intriguing statement, Daniel called for his brother's help with the fort, and Matthew ran off to assist. Eleanor remained on the porch a moment longer, watching the boys work together, their breath forming small clouds in the winter air. Whatever tomorrow might bring today, they were here together building something from the simplest materials, twigs and snow, trust and care, the shared experience of survival, transformed into the beginnings of joy. Nathan worked through the night at Robert Wilson's bedside, applying every technique and treatment his medical training offered. By dawn, the immediate crisis had passed, though Wilson remained weak, his heart damaged beyond full recovery. "You've bought me some time," Wilson said weakly as Nathan checked his pulse for the 100th time. "Enough to see Elizabeth through her final journey, I hope." "If you rest completely," Nathan cautioned. "No exertion, no excitement. Your heart has sustained significant damage." Wilson managed a ghost of a smile. "We're both dying, Elizabeth and I, just on different timetables." He reached for Nathan's hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Promise me you will look after her when I can't. Make her comfortable, ease her passing." "Of course," Nathan agreed, "but with proper care, your own condition could stabilize for months, even years." "Perhaps, but I've been half of a whole for 30 years, Nathan. I don't fancy trying to be a whole alone." Wilson's eyes, though tired, held a calm acceptance that Nathan recognized from his military days, the look of a man who had made peace with mortality. "Just promise you'll see us both through this final campaign with dignity." "I promise," Nathan said solemnly, "as your doctor and your friend." By mid-morning, Wilson had fallen into a natural sleep, his breathing shallow but regular. Nathan, exhausted from the night's vigil, stepped outside the hotel for a moment of fresh air. The town was coming to life around him, shopkeepers opening their establishments, a wagon delivering goods to the general store, children making their way to the small schoolhouse at the end of the street. Normal life continuing, undramatic but essential. "Dr. Blackwood." Nathan turned to find Sheriff Holt approaching, hat in hand, in a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. "Sheriff," he acknowledged with a nod. "What can I do for you?" Holt shifted uncomfortably, clearly rehearsing words in his mind before speaking. "I wanted to apologize proper," he said finally, "for the hanging business, for not looking deeper into your circumstances before judgment was passed." The simple apology, offered without excuses or qualifications, surprised Nathan. "You were doing your job, Sheriff, upholding the law as you understood it." "Maybe so, but there's law and there's justice, and sometimes they ain't the same thing." Holt replaced his hat, squinting up at the winter sun. "The town council's meeting this afternoon. They're hoping you might attend, hear their proposal for the medical clinic directly." Nathan hesitated, thinking of Eleanor waiting at the farm, of the conversation interrupted by Reed's arrival with news of Wilson's collapse. "I need to get back to the Hayes place," he said. "I promised to return today." "Won't take but an hour," Holt pressed, "and it would mean a lot to the council. Show of good faith, like." After a moment's consideration, Nathan nodded. "Very well. I'll stop by the meeting before heading back." As Holt walked away, Nathan found himself torn between competing obligations to the Wilsons, to the town council, to Eleanor, and the children waiting at the farm. The life he had once known, with its clear professional duties and boundaries, was reasserting itself, pulling him in multiple directions. Yet underlying as all these obligations was a clarity that had emerged during his conversation with Matthew the day before. Whatever path he chose now, doctor in town, circuit rider, or something else entirely, it would include Eleanor and Hope alongside his sons. The family they had begun building in crisis and necessity was worth preserving, worth formalizing, worth choosing deliberately. The town council meeting proved longer than anticipated, with detailed discussions of the proposed clinic, the salary offered, the expectations for a town physician. Nathan listened attentively, asked appropriate questions, and finally promised to give them an answer within the week. By the time he checked on the Wilsons once more and collected his horse from the livery, afternoon was fading toward evening. Dark clouds gathering on the western horizon suggested another storm approaching, hastening his preparations for the ride back to Eleanor's farm. "You're cutting it close, Doctor," the livery owner observed as Nathan saddled his horse. "That storm looks mean, and the trail to the Hayes place gets treacherous in the dark." "I've ridden worse," Nathan replied, though privately he shared the man's concern. The mountain paths had taught him respect for winter storms and their deadly potential. He rode out of town at a brisk pace, hoping to outrun the weather front clearly visible on the horizon. The wind had already picked up, carrying the metallic scent of snow, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as the sun disappeared behind thickening clouds. 2 miles from town, the first flakes began to fall, large, wet crystals that quickly gave way to a driving curtain of white. Nathan urged his horse faster, knowing that visibility would soon become a serious concern. By the time Eleanor's farm came into view, the storm had developed into a full blizzard. Wind howled across the open fields, driving snow horizontally into drifts that obscured the trail. Nathan's face burned with cold, despite the scarf wrapped around his lower features, and his horse labored through deepening snow. A light glowed from the cabin windows, a beacon in the gathering darkness. Nathan felt a surge of relief at the sight, followed immediately by profound gratitude for the shelter and warmth it represented, not just physical comfort, but the emotional sanctuary Eleanor had created for all of them. As he approached the barn, the cabin door opened, spilling golden light onto the snow. Eleanor stood framed in the doorway, a shawl clutched around her shoulders, her expression shifting from worry to relief as she recognized him. "Nathan," she called over the howl of the wind, "hurry inside. The boys have been watching for you since sunset." He stabled his horse quickly, ensuring the animal had water and feed before making his way through knee-deep snow to the cabin. Eleanor held the door against the wind as he entered, helping him remove his ice-crusted coat and scarf. "We were beginning to fear you'd been caught in the storm," she said, her hands efficiently checking him for signs of frostbite. Matthew was preparing to organize a search party with Daniel and the broom as his deputy. Nathan laughed, the sound rusty after the tense hours of riding through worsening conditions. "I'm sorry to worry you. The town council meeting ran long, and then I had to check on the Wilsons once more before leaving." "Pa!" Daniel launched himself across the room, colliding with Nathan's legs in an enthusiastic embrace. "Did you bring us anything from town?" "Daniel," Eleanor admonished gently, "your father has just ridden through a blizzard. Perhaps give him a moment to warm up before making demands." Nathan ruffled his younger son's hair affectionately. "As a matter of fact, I did bring something." He reached into his inner pocket, producing 2 small paper-wrapped packages. "Candy sticks from the general store. One for you, one for your brother." Daniel accepted the treat with unabashed delight, while Matthew approached more sedately, though his eyes lit up at the gift. "Thank you, Pa," he said, with the careful manners Nathan had been trying to instill. "How is the sick lady and her husband?" "Mrs. Wilson is resting comfortably for now," Nathan replied, moving to warm his hands by the fire. "Mr. Wilson had a heart attack yesterday, but he's stable this evening." "You look exhausted," Eleanor observed, bringing him a cup of hot coffee. "Sit, eat, then you can tell us everything." The simple domestic scene, the fire crackling warmly, the boys enjoying their treats, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Eleanor moving efficiently around the kitchen area, struck Nathan with unexpected force. This was what he had been missing during those years in the mountains, not just comfort or safety, but connection, belonging, the rhythm of family life. Over a simple but hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread, Nathan recounted his time in town, Wilson's condition, the town council's proposal, the growing acceptance he felt from the townspeople who had once been ready to hang him as a thief. "They really want you to be their doctor," Matthew said, pride evident in his voice. "Because you're the best." "They need a doctor," Nathan corrected modestly, "and I happen to be qualified." "More than qualified," Eleanor added. James always spoke of the desperate need for proper medical care in these remote areas. He dreamed of establishing a practice that could serve not just the town, but the outlying homesteads as well. "That's essentially what the council is proposing," Nathan explained. "A clinic in town, but with the understanding that I would make regular circuits to more distant settlements." He hesitated, then added, "They're offering a house as part of the arrangement, the old Peterson place on the edge of town." A brief silence followed this revelation. Eleanor's expression remained carefully neutral as she cleared the dishes from the table. "That sounds like a generous offer," she said finally, her back to him as she worked at the wash basin. "The Peterson house is quite large, as I recall. Plenty of room for you and the boys." Nathan glanced at Matthew, who was watching this exchange with unusual intensity. The boy gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Eleanor," Nathan began, rising from his chair to approach her. "That conversation we started yesterday before Reed arrived with news of Wilson's collapse." She turned to face him, her hands still wet from the dishwater. "Yes. Before Nathan could continue, Hope began to cry from her cradle, soft at first, then with increasing urgency. Eleanor moved immediately to tend to her, lifting the infant and checking her diaper. "She's hungry," she explained, settling into the rocking chair to nurse. "We can continue our conversation in a moment." Nathan nodded, turning his attention to the boys. "It's late, and you've both had an exciting day. Time for bed, I think." Daniel protested half-heartedly, but a yawn undermined his argument. Matthew, understanding as always, helped guide his brother toward the storeroom that had become their bedroom. "Good night, Pa," he said meaningfully. "Good night, Mrs. Hayes." As the boys disappeared into their room, Nathan built up the fire against the intensifying storm outside. Wind howled around the cabin eaves and snow pattered against the windows like tiny, insistent fingers. "It's going to be a bad one," Eleanor observed, adjusting Hope at her breast. "I'm glad you made it back before the worst hit." "So am I." Nathan settled into the chair opposite her, watching the firelight play across her features. "Eleanor, about the town council's offer. You should accept it." She interrupted, her eyes on Hope rather than him. "It's a wonderful opportunity, Nathan. A chance to practice medicine openly again, to provide stability for the boys, to use your skills where they're desperately needed." "I am considering it," he acknowledged, "but not in the way you might think." Eleanor looked up, a question in her eyes. "I won't separate my family again." Nathan continued, his voice gentle but firm. "These past weeks have shown me what's truly important, not just my profession or the boys' education, but the home we've begun to build here, together." Hope had finished nursing, and Eleanor carefully adjusted her clothing before settling the infant against her shoulder to burp. "What exactly are you saying, Nathan?" He moved from his chair to kneel beside her rocker, bringing their faces level. "I'm saying that whatever decision I make about the town's offer depends entirely on one factor, whether you and Hope would come with us." Eleanor's hand stilled on the baby's back. "Nathan." "I love you, Eleanor," he said simply, the words finally spoken aloud after weeks of growing certainty. "Not as a replacement for Sarah, not out of gratitude for saving me from the gallows, but for who you are, your strength, your compassion, your fierce determination to build something good in this harsh place." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know it's soon," Nathan acknowledged. "We've known each other only a short time and under extraordinary circumstances. You're still grieving, James still adjusting to motherhood. I don't expect an immediate answer." "Nathan," Eleanor began, again her voice steady despite the tears now slipping down her cheeks. "When James was dying, he made me promise something. Not just to survive, but to find joy again someday. To be open to life's unexpected gifts." She shifted Hope to cradle her in one arm, her other hand reaching for Nathan's. "You and the boys have been that gift arriving when I needed you most, bringing laughter and purpose back into this house." Hope squirmed between them, her tiny hand finding a loose strand of Eleanor's hair and gripping it firmly as if to physically connect them all. "Is that a yes?" Nathan asked Hope, rising in his chest. "Will you marry me, Eleanor? Let us become a true family, you, me, the boys, and Hope." Eleanor's smile bloomed through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Nathan Blackwood." Outside, the storm raged on snow and wind, reshaping the landscape into something new and pristine. Inside, wrapped in warmth and newfound certainty, two people who had survived tremendous loss discovered the courage to begin again, to build something lasting from the fragments of broken dreams. And in the small bedroom off the main cabin, two boys who had heard everything through the partially open door exchanged triumphant smiles before finally surrendering to sleep, secure in the knowledge that their family, once reduced to a grieving father, and his sons had expanded to include a mother, a sister, and a future bright with possibility. Spring came to Montana Territory in fits and starts. Warm days followed by sudden freezes, meadows greening beneath lingering patches of snow, creeks swollen with runoff from the mountains. By April, the transformation was well underway, winter's grip finally broken by the persistent advance of new life. On a clear Sunday morning, the small church in Redemption was filled beyond capacity. Townsfolk and outlying settlers alike gathered to witness the union of Dr. Nathan Blackwood and Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. Children fidgeted in their Sunday best, women dabbed at sentimental tears, and men nodded approvingly at the match that had become the talk of the community over the winter months. At the front of the church, Nathan stood tall in a new suit, Matthew and Daniel beside him in matching jackets, their hair slicked down in a futile attempt at formality. Reed, serving as both officiant and friend, reviewed his notes with calm assurance. "Nervous?" Reed asked quietly as they waited for the bride to appear. Nathan shook his head, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Not at all. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." The small organ began to play, and the congregation rose as one. Eleanor appeared at the back of the church, Hope in her arms, both dressed in blue, the color of spring sky. She wore no veil, her auburn hair simply arranged with wildflowers Matthew had gathered that morning. As she walked toward him, Nathan felt a profound sense of rightness, not the erasing of past grief or the forgetting of those lost, but the creation of something new and equally precious alongside those memories. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Reed speaking eloquently about new beginnings, about families formed through choice, as well as blood, about love that heals and strengthens. When the moment came to exchange vows, Nathan took Eleanor's hands in his, Hope now cradled in Matthew's careful arms. "Eleanor," he began, his voice steady with certainty, "I come to you not as a perfect man, but as one who has known both joy and sorrow, who understands the preciousness of what we're building together. I promise to honor the past we both carry while creating a future filled with love, respect, and partnership. I will be father to Hope as if she were my own, and I will stand beside you through whatever challenges life brings, grateful every day for the second chance we've found in each other." Eleanor's eyes shone with unshed tears as she spoke her own vows. "Nathan, when you came into my life, I was preparing for one journey while you were fleeing from another. What neither of us expected was that our paths would join to create a new direction entirely. I promise to love your sons as my own, to honor the memory of Sarah in their lives, to support your calling as a healer, and to build with you a home where all of us can thrive. In you, I have found not just a husband, but a partner in creating something beautiful from the ruins of what was lost." Reed pronounced them husband and wife with evident satisfaction. As Nathan kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in applause led enthusiastically by Daniel, who had been practicing his clapping specifically for this moment. The celebration spilled out of the church into the spring sunshine, with tables set up on the green for a community feast. Among the well-wishers was a frail but determined Elizabeth Wilson, attending what would likely be her last public event, supported by her husband, whose own health had stabilized enough to see this day. "You've done well, Nathan," Wilson said, clasping his hand warmly. "Both professionally and personally, this town is fortunate to have you. And we're fortunate to have found such a welcoming community." Nathan replied, his arm around Eleanor's waist. Elizabeth, her face gaunt, but her eyes bright with pleasure, reached out to touch Hope's cheek. "Catherine will be so pleased when she receives our letter. To know her nephews are thriving, that you've found happiness again." Nathan nodded, thinking of the correspondence that had begun flowing between them and Sarah's sister over the past months. "We're looking forward to her visit this summer. The boys are excited to meet their aunt, to learn more about their mother's childhood. Life has a way of coming full circle," Elizabeth observed, her voice weak but her smile genuine. "From loss to renewal, from flight to homecoming." As the Wilsons moved on to greet other guests, Nathan found himself surrounded by his newly formalized family. Eleanor with Hope on her hip, Matthew standing tall beside his father Daniel, darting between groups of well-wishers with limitless energy. The Peterson house on the edge of town now belonged to them, its rooms gradually filling with furniture, books, medical supplies, and the everyday artifacts of family life. The clinic in town had opened the previous month, already serving a steady stream of patients. And Eleanor's farm remained in their possession as well, a retreat for weekends, a connection to the land, a reminder of where their journey together had begun. Reed approached, glass raised in a private toast. "To Redemption Ridge," he said with a knowing smile. "Not just a place, but a state of being." "Redemption Ridge," Nathan repeated, savoring the phrase. "I like that." Eleanor leaned into his side, her presence a steady warmth. "It's perfect," she agreed. "A name for what we found here together." As afternoon sunlight bathed the gathering in golden light, Nathan looked out over the community that had once nearly taken his life and now embraced him as their doctor, their neighbor, their friend. The path that had led him here, from battlefield surgeon to grieving widower, from fugitive to mountain man, from condemned thief to respected physician, seemed impossibly convoluted yet somehow inevitable. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, noticing his momentary abstraction. Nathan smiled, drawing her closer. "That sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be." Around them, spring continued its inexorable transformation of the landscape, new leaves unfurling, wildflowers dotting the meadows, birds returning to build nests and raise their young. Nature's own testament to the possibility of renewal, to the persistent hope that follows even the harshest winter. For the Blackwood family, Nathan and Eleanor, Matthew and Daniel Baby Hope, and all who might follow that renewal had taken human form, a family forged not just through blood or law, but through choice, courage, and the willingness to build something lasting from the fragments of what had been lost. Redemption indeed.